here we're bringing to you in your own living room some of America's outstanding teachers from college and university. In the School of Speech at Northwestern University, this man, Dr. Irving J. Lee, is a professor of speech. In the field of our communication with each other, Dr. Lee is primarily concerned with the problems we face in making ourselves clear, the obstacles to communications between people, the area we know as general semantics. Mr. Lee is the author of the book, How to Talk with People, and Language Habits in Human Affairs. In the 6 times you meet him, Mr. Lee will therefore take up the very serious problems we human beings face to try talking sense. Today, he faces up to a question that, well, any of us might throw at him. Just what is general semantics? Mr. Irving J. Lee.
One of my students not so very long ago had to listen to a series of lectures, and when he came out of it, had some very definite ideas, then ran onto a bit of a poem which he thought expressed those attitudes of his, and that poem is called Two Speakers, and I'd like to read it. He says, they may be short of stature, they may be short of gags, they may be short of listeners as the afternoon lags and lags. But wistfully I wonder as I sit there, bored to death, if I'll ever run across one who perchance is short of breath. Well, I hope that doesn't happen this afternoon, or in any of the sessions that I have with you, because I'm interested in the problems of human communication. That is the business of man talking to man, whether it is in a formal situation or over the luncheon table or in the busy confines of our daily activities. I'm interested in the kinds of things that happen when people talk together. In short, I'm interested in communication in the broadest possible sense. Now, the moment one mentions the word communication, a host of problems arise. For example, they range all the way from the very simple problems of clarity to some of the most sophisticated problems we can think about. I'm told of a story of a man who went to a downtown Washington hotel, and as he was paying his bill, he noticed behind the cashier's cage this little sign. It said, in order to substantiate our desire to accommodate our guests, we would appreciate your cooperation to anticipate your credit requirements before departure. He asked the young lady in the cage what that meant, and she turned and said, positively no checks cashed. Well, problems of clarity are very interesting. We ought to be able to learn to say what we have to say very simply and easily and clearly. Anybody who's ever worked on an income tax return, I think, knows the kind of thing I'm thinking about. If only they would say it in words that we would have a little bit less trouble with. And sometimes as we study problems of clarity, they work in reverse. Sometimes when you use very small words, you get into more trouble than if you use very big words. For example, Gertrude Stein once wrote a very small word portrait of a woman, Florence Descotes. And as I read this, please note that she's speaking almost invariably or writing in words, very small words. There are some that are 2 syllables, but they're everyday words. And I'd like to ask you whether you see what she's after. This is about a woman. Never to be restless, never to be afraid, never to ask will they come, never to have made, never to like having had, little that is less than, she made it do, 1 and 2, thank her for everything. Now, I have trouble discovering exactly what Gertrude Stein was saying. But if this be translated into larger words, that is, the words of many syllables, suddenly something is communicated. May I read it in a more sophisticated statement? Florence Descotes was a balanced, reconciled, and courageous person. She didn't harass herself and others with trifles. She never thought the thing done perfect, nor did she seek possession. She was content with the residue of experience, great or little. She commands our gratitude. Now, it seems to me I get something from the longer statement that I didn't get from the one which used small words. And in our studies of communication, we're very much interested in knowing under what circumstances is simplicity useful, under what circumstances is complexity useful. And then, of course, you can run from problems of clarity to matters having to do with the choice of words. You notice how easy it is sometimes to choose a word to say something which doesn't convey what you intended. A lady wrote a letter to the editor of the Cleveland Press some time ago, and she addresses her letter to the editor, in which she, it seems to me, dramatizes the problem I just hinted at. She said, "Dear sir, it's about time somebody put his foot down on dirty newspapers that print indecent language in their columns which go into the homes of respectable men and women with children. I will not make matters worse by repeating the word which appeared in bold black print in your issue of November the 12th on page 33 in relation to a dog show. I will only say that it was a harsh, short synonym for a girl dog." Now, this is not the first time I've seen that nasty word in your paper, and if I see it once more, I'm going to get good and mad. Well, obviously, the choice of the individual words created reverberations in her, and when that happens, one ought to ask a very interesting question. Is something wrong with her, or is something wrong with the writer? But these are problems that I'll be getting to. Then sometimes the problems of communication move off into the greater, more difficult problems of misrepresentation and distortion. That is, we live in a period in the world's history when the Cold War is ever with us, when the propaganda battles are being fought from one end of the year to the other. Paul Porter tells a story that I think gives one small segment of this fairly clearly. He says, during my economic mission to Greece some years ago, the local communist editors frequently distorted the purpose and objectives of my mission. I gave them a classic opportunity for misrepresentation one night at a banquet given in my honor in Macedonia. The dinner started late and was garnished with oratory. When I was finally called up to speak, it was past midnight. Since I was tired and sleepy, I made my remarks brief but cordial. It's indeed a pleasure to be here tonight with you good citizens of Greece, I said. You Greeks and we Americans have very much in common. We like to eat, we like to drink, and we like to sit around and talk. Now, the very next day, the communist chief blazed the assertion that I had insulted the Greeks. Ambassador Porter said that we're just like Americans, gluttons, drunkards, and gossipers. Well, is there a defense against that sort of thing? Can we do anything to protect ourselves against conscious misrepresentation? Well, there are some things we can do, but not too many. And what they are, I shall be getting to again in this series. Now, I'm interested, in short, in the kinds of things that happen between people that produce trouble. What are the things you do? What are the things I do which tend to promote friction, tension, conflict, confusion, misunderstanding between us? And these are some of the things that I should like to explore. Now, let me begin, if I may, by exploring them from a slightly different point of view. If I can give you some indication of the magnitude of one kind of problem in a slightly larger context. In the 1941, Sir Norman Angell, the great British economist and educator, wrote an essay called Education in the Present Crisis. And I'd like to read two paragraphs which will put my interest in a very larger context. I'm reading from what he says. If the world has nearly destroyed itself, it is not from lack of knowledge in the sense that we lack the knowledge to cure cancer, but it is due to the fact that the mass of men have not applied to public policy knowledge which they already possess, which is indeed of almost universal possession, deducible from the facts of everyday life. He goes on. If this is true, then no education which consists mainly in the dissemination of knowledge can save us. If men can disregard in their policies the facts they already know, they can just as easily disregard new facts which they do not at present know. What is needed is this, the development in men of that particular type of skill which will enable them to make social use of knowledge already in their possession, enable them to apply simple, sometimes self-evident truths to the guidance of their common life. Now may I put what Sir Norman is saying in my own words. Certainly in the last 100 years, it's a truism to say that the boundaries of what we know keep getting pushed further and further back. We know more and more about more and more. Take 100 people in business or professional activities, and they will be far more specialized. They will know more and more about a greater number of things in comparison with their predecessor 50 to 75 years ago. That is, the range of what we know keeps getting pushed further and further. Now, I know very few people who would say, we know enough. Let's quit. Let's stop the advancing front of time. Let's quit the research we're doing. Let's rest on our laurels. I know very few. Think, for example, what we wouldn't give to know what causes those cells to proliferate into cancer. Think what we wouldn't give at this moment to know why the boy down the street gets polio and the girl neighbor next door doesn't, and why one is desperately injured and the other isn't. We'd give a great deal, and there are, as a matter of fact, I know of no area where people have already said, let's rest content. We know enough. Let's proceed to stop. But about 30-odd years ago, a man by the name of Alfred Korzybski, K-O-R-Z-Y-S-K-I, whose name isn't too well known, a man who has had very little academic recognition, who has had very little to do with any of our existing universities, colleges, and so on. But he had a slightly different but interesting idea. This is what he thought. What is there, he said, in the far reaches of a university library? What is there that our professors of anthropology and zoology can agree on? What is there in this vast, tremendous intellectual creation that we've produced? What is there that we all know together? Are there any ideas, simple, complicated, that everybody can agree on? And then he asked another question. If we could find those ideas, he said, is it possible that the neglect of this common wisdom, is it possible that this distillate from all the areas that we know, when neglected, leads to trouble? That is to say, if you and I can agree, no matter how specialized you are or how specialized I am, on what we know in common, then is it possible that if I don't pay attention to that common wisdom, if I lose it, that maybe that's the place to look for the source of tension and conflict and confusion in our everyday talking? And then Korzybski asked a simpler question. It was this. Can we find this common wisdom, this common distillate, and when we do, is it at all possible that we can put it in words of one syllable so we can teach it to our children or we can teach it in the grave? And whether or not he succeeded in this great mission of his, of finding what we all ought to know together, and whether or not that is responsible, the neglect is responsible for the tension, is a matter that I shall be trying to tell you about in these sessions. And whether or not I can say it in words that are simple enough so that we can teach these great big ideas to our youngsters is also something that I think you'll be able to test better than I. Now may I begin by my, again, approaching this problem of how to talk sense by asking you very quickly for a moment or two to think about a diagram that I'd like to draw on the board. That is, I've drawn it, and if you would look at it very briefly, what I think I've drawn is this. I've tried to ask this question. Whenever anybody behaves, regardless of the nature, regardless of the situation, what are the phases through which his actions go? What are the smallest units into which I can break up his big action without losing a sense of continuity? Now, let's take something very simple. Perhaps fire were to break out in this studio or down the street. Let me call that a happening or an event or a stimulus. Or say a small kitten were to suddenly come into this room and get on top of my rostrum. That would be a happening. Then, if you or I were in the presence of the happening, it would make some impact on us. I would see it or hear it. It would affect my nervous system. And if I were in full possession of all of my faculties, it would make some, as we say, neurological impact. I would know about it. But that isn't all I would do. Something else would happen. I would proceed to evaluate. That is, I would size up this situation. I'd think about it. I'd interpret it. I'd wonder about it somehow. In other words, I would evaluate it, and evaluation being a complicated thing, a lot of things would go on. I would see it, hear it, smell it, and interpret it. I would make some assumptions. I would assume something about this, and I might feel somehow. Thus, as the kitten came in, I would see it, and I might assume that this is a very pleasant interruption, a very pleasant way of adding a little drama to what might not be so dramatic, and I might feel pleasant. Or I might assume that somebody didn't do his job well, in which case I would feel angry. In other words, I would see, assume, and feel, and evaluate the situation. Then, I might talk and or act. Now, I suppose if flames broke out in the room that I'm in at this moment, I suppose I might say to somebody, what do we do about it? Or let's get out of here. Or look, isn't someone going to do anything about it? Or I might act. In other words, I just depart from these surroundings very quickly. Or I might proceed perhaps to go over and try to stamp it out. Now then, it is my basic premise that these four things happen with almost every bit of human behavior. Now, I admit that there are some occasions when phase 3 doesn't seem to exist. For example, if you shoot a pinpoint of light in my eye, that's a happening. It'll make an impact on my pupil, but I don't think I'll do much evaluating. My pupil will close. Or I think perhaps if you were suddenly to jab me with a pin, that would be the happening. It would make an impact. I would probably feel it, but I don't think I'd do any thinking about it except to jump or yell or run away or ask you to stop. So that I want to suggest that for the great important moments of human behavior, and even for the unimportant moments of human behavior, these four things happen. That's my first premise, and the first thing I'd like to ask you to think about. And something on which we can get a great deal of agreement right around the university curriculum. But I'll come back to that in a minute. I now want to make my second point, which is this. We ought to be able to distinguish between our evaluations of situations, A, which make sense, are sensible, are mature, intelligent, wise, and those which are not so intelligent, not so wise, bluntly, those which are stupid. Or we ought to be able to distinguish between, I imagine you can think that there are some things I might do if flames broke out into this room, which would be sensible. There are some things I might do which would not be sensible. And it is the thesis, or it is the basic position or theory of the students of general semantics, that every bit of human behavior, every bit of it, ought to be analyzable or distinguished into these two great categories. Some talking makes sense, some talking does not make sense. And I'd like just to give you a couple of quick illustrations of what I'm after. Dr. Eugene Hartley wrote a book called Problems in Prejudice, made a study of the attitudes of 800 graduating seniors at a number of Eastern colleges and universities, of their attitudes towards minority groups. Now, what he did was give them a very simple form of a very widely known test used in sociology, nothing but a sheet of paper, on which he had the names of 30 or 40 minority groups, Mexicans, Hungarians, Poles, Italians, Presbyterians, and so on. And they were listed down one side. Then there were a series of columns divided as follows. I would not like to have these people enter the country, live in my town, live on my block, join my country club, come to my house for dinner, go out on a date with, marry. That is, if your attitude towards, for example, Presbyterians was well enough defined, you'd put an X in the appropriate box. Now, I'm not sure that this is a very sharp test of human attitudes, but it will give you indications if you try it out on a great number. Now, when Hartley did this test was originally devised by Professor Bogardus, the distinguished sociologist. When he did this, he included in the names of minority groups the names of three entirely imaginary minority groups: the Pyreneans, the Danarians, and the Wallonians. And he found that on the average there was just as much prejudice directed against these wholly imaginary groups as against any other on the list. And I like his conclusion. He says, and so it seems reasonable to conclude that the behavior of the Pyreneans, the Wallonians, and the Danarians didn't have very much to do with the prejudice that was directed against them. Now, please observe, a group of graduating seniors at the university level were presented with a piece of paper and some names on it. They read it. It made an impact. They made some assumptions about it. They felt somehow, and they proceeded to reply saying that they disliked these imaginary people. Now, something seems wrong about that to me. That looks like a mis-evaluation. It looks as though they did something that was strange and quaint and awry. My problem is, how can I talk about that so as to prevent that kind of not entirely sensible behavior from happening again? Think of another very simple kind of situation that I ran across. This is a test by two other psychologists, Miller and Bugelski. They tell of 31 young men at a camp. This was before the outbreak of World War II. They were asked to rate Japanese and Mexicans on a pencil and paper test. Immediately after they did, the men were exposed to a frustrating experience. The men were not allowed to go to the camp theater as they had expected, but they were told they would be required to work in the camp instead. Then after they were told that, they were given these rating sheets, and the results showed a marked diminution in the number of favorable traits and an increase in the number of unfavorable traits ascribed to the two groups. Now, something seems wrong about that to me. That is, here were men responding to minority people, and they were responding to it in a very interesting way the second time in comparison to the first. How can I talk about that so that I shall perhaps clarify or keep us from that sort of behavior? One other a quick illustration of what I'm after, I suppose, can be given in terms of animal behavior. There's an experiment that it would be very interesting to perform, but sometimes it doesn't work as sharply as I shall tell you about it. It consists in taking a galvanized container, metal container about so high, and filling it with water. And the galvanized container contains some notches so that we can put a glass partition right almost in the middle. Now, this requires that we find a walleye pike or a northern pike. Doesn't make much difference, but we ought to have a hungry one if we can possibly find it. And we put him over here and let him swim around. Then on this side of the container, we take a handful of minnows, the walleye pike's favorite food. We just dump them in and let them swim around freely. Now, if you will stand off in a situation like this, you'll notice that the pike goes after the minnows. That is, you'll hear a swish and a dull thud. And the pike will bump up against the glass and then bounce back and do it again. And we'll keep on doing that. And you stand off with a clocker and count this. Now, this is no place to get into any controversy, but if the fish, it makes a difference. Whether the fish comes from northern Wisconsin or northern Michigan or somewhere else, as to how many tries it will take until the fish quits. There are those who say that it takes a little longer if the fish comes from northern Michigan, but I won't fight that out. Nevertheless, there will come a time when the fish will stop. That is, he's learned if you go after these fish, you get bumped and you don't catch the minnows. At that point, when he swims lazily all by himself, the experimenter removes the glass partition, and the minnows proceed to swim freely, almost coming up against the pike, and some of them bang against his gills. But he knows what he knows. He knows that you don't go after those, and in the midst of plenty, he proceeds to starve, literally, and if you wait long enough, he will die in the midst of all these minnows. Somehow or other, in the presence of the happening, which made an impact, if we can think that the fish evaluates, thinks, interprets in his own way, and then proceeds to act, there's something about his behavior that isn't quite sensible. His behavior leaves something to be desired. There's something off. It's awry. Now, how can we describe the pattern of that behavior? How can one describe what happens to the pike? And I have a hunch that you can, almost at this moment, think of illustrations yourself in which human beings behave like that. And when they do, in their talking and acting, we begin to have a pattern of the difficulties that they get into. So I'm very much interested in a very interesting question, since I used an illustration of an animal, of a way of saying or stating the difference between human beings and animals. Now, there are many respects in which I am very much like fish, in which we are, in our human beings are very much like animals. Thus, for example, animals need plants in the field. Animals use other animals for food and energy. We do too. The only sources of energy that we can get hold of are plants and other animals. Animals move around. They jump, run, gamble, fight, procreate, do all the things moving around that you can imagine. So do human beings. We do almost all of the things, perhaps not as well in some respects others. We move around. But there is one thing a human being can do that, so far as I know, an animal can't do. And that is, a human being can build on, summarize, use, and digest the labor and experience of the past. So far as I know, an animal, let's take an example, a robin or a beaver or a bee proceeds to build and produce honey exactly as countless generations before. A robin builds a nest pretty much as robins have built them before. That is, so far as we know, there doesn't seem to be progress in the world of animal life. However, among human beings, you find improvement. This TV began, I suppose, it had its beginnings with Raymer, who checked the movement, the time it took the planets to revolve in the sky, building on what he found a Clerk Maxwell, picking up where Clerk Maxwell left off, Marconi, De Forest, and so on, right down to this magnificent achievement. Human beings can pick up where others leave off. Now, why can we do that? Why can you and I pick up where others leave off? Because they can write it down, and we can begin to interpret it. That is, it is this symbolizing capacity. It is our capacity to use words, language, symbols, to write what we have found down which allows succeeding generations to pick up precisely where we left off, and thus we can proceed to add. I'm interested in this question. Why is it that sometimes human beings don't build on the experience of the past? Is it possible that in our talking and acting and in our evaluating, we can get some clues as to why people don't build on experience? Is it possible that we can explain why the fish perhaps ought to die if he behaves this way? And it is this search for the means of symbolizing and talking and evaluating that we may discover how not to behave like the animals. A drunkard, I suppose, from one point of view, is a man who behaves just like the animals. He's a consumer. He never produces. He never builds on the experience of the past. He's a destroyer, almost entirely. And for human beings to live a life of consumption and destruction only is ultimately to be self-defeating. I can say this perhaps in another way. If animals engage in destruction, conflict, fighting among themselves, I'm almost willing to take that for granted. That's all right with me. But when human beings do that, when human beings misunderstand each other, develop prejudices against non-existing people, then tensions and difficulties are inevitable. Can anything be done to prevent those tensions and conflicts and confusions and misunderstandings? That's what I now should like to do in the succeeding sessions in these talks that I should like to give. Now, as a way of preparing us in order to plunge right into the lessons that I'm interested in, I'm going to ask first whether we all know how to make a statement of fact. Now, I picked this up at the grocery store on the way in. The ordinary apple, the kind of thing that I suppose I haven't tampered with it. Here it is. Suppose I say, or suppose you say, there are seeds in this apple. Suppose you did the same thing in your icebox or pantry. You brought an apple, and you were to say there are seeds in this apple. The question I want to ask is, are you talking factually? Did you make a statement of fact? How you answer the question is, I shall take as my starting point to go on the study of proper evaluation. If you say that is a statement of fact, then I shall understand that you have very interesting patterns of evaluation which may or may not get us into trouble. If you say that is not a statement of fact, I shall ask you, do you know what kind of statement that is? And if you do not answer in the terms that I shall describe, I shall not be surprised if trouble comes.
This is Dr. Irving J. Lee of the School of Speech at Northwestern University. Mr. Lee is professionally concerned with the symbolic world of words we humans live in, of, and by, and the world of reality which those words are supposed to stand for. To show us how this concern ties into everyday practical affairs, here's Mr. Lee with the second part of his discussion, talking sense, and asking us the question, how do you know how to make a statement?
In our previous session, I ended by asking you to think about an ordinary apple, one which preferably you got from your pantry or one which you picked up from a basket in the local grocery store, one that hadn't been tampered with, and an ordinary apple of the sort you would find. And I asked you, suppose then you made a statement, you were to make a statement. There are seeds in this apple. And I asked, would you consider that a statement of fact? Now, when I ask people that question, they sometimes say, well, of course. Of course that's a statement of fact. There have been seeds in all the other apples I've dealt with. Every time I've ever opened an apple, and besides, I've never heard of anybody producing a seedless apple. As far as I'm concerned, that's a statement of fact. Now, I should like to begin by casting some doubts about that. I'd like to ask you to wonder whether actually that is something you know. Whether if you say this is a statement of fact that there are seeds in this, whether actually we are thinking as adequately and carefully as we ought to. Now, while you think about that for a moment more, I'd like to do a little different kind of demonstration. Now, it's very difficult for you to see, but I have an ordinary box of matches of the sort, and this is just an ordinary penny, and I should like in full view to see if I can make this penny disappear. And I'll put the penny right on top of the box and face the magic words, e pluribus unum, or something equally devastating. Well, it didn't work. The penny is still here. It didn't work that time, but let me try it again. Sometimes these things need practice. Now, let me say the magic words, e pluribus unum, and the penny disappeared. Now, I'll just like to leave this out in full view on my rostrum here. Suppose I could ask you the question, where's the penny? What are some of the things you might say? Well, when I've done this before, a small group of people, someone will say, it's up your sleeve, and I will say up the left sleeve, or it's in the coat pocket, or my hand, or it's in among the matches, it's in the matchbox, or it's in this room, it's in this particular studio. And then I would ask, if we look at all of those statements, which of those are statements of fact? Which one is the one you'd be most willing to bet on? Which is the one that you'd be willing to gamble on? I have a feeling you would say that all of those statements up my sleeve or in my pocket, or those you aren't as sure of, but I'm quite or reasonably sure you would say that the statement, the penny is in this room, I think you would say that that's a statement of fact. And momentarily, I'd like to ask you to think about that a moment from a slightly different point of view. Is that something you know? Is that something you can be sure about? Or is that something that seems very, very, very likely? May I give you as a third problem before I deal with it, the kind of problem that sometimes we'll use in police training classes or when we're trying to teach policemen about these things. Now, this is a very simple situation. Let's assume that we have a house, and the house had been decorated the night before, and the decorators, the painters, and everybody else left about 5 o'clock or whatever the usual time is, and the fast-drying decoration, the decorators used fast-drying paint and so on. And that evening, you or the man and the woman proceeded to put all of their things in effect back. And the point of interest in this story is in the living room, there is a cabinet in which the precious family silverware was placed. And let's suppose that the man and the woman did all the putting away, and they were very careful to put the silverware in the chest or the case and close it and go off to bed. The next morning, they come downstairs, and the first thing that strikes their attention is the fact that the door is open and all the silverware is gone. They look around the room and find no signs of people being there, except near the room there is the window is halfway open, and they see some footprints. They then quickly call the police, who come, look all over the whole room, see whether they can find any signs or prints or anything of the sort. And the only print they find is the print of a hand, and let me just sort of, as if it were right on the large board near the window. And the hand can be observed by the policemen who come. And they dust it, quickly send it to Washington to the FBI, and they get in by return mail one of these identification charts which has the picture of a man and handprints with the history of the man and handprints which exactly match the handprints on the wall. And let's say that the man on the identification sheet is named Joe. Now may I ask a very simple question. Suppose I were to say the silverware was stolen. Would I be making a statement of fact? Or would you be likely to say yes? Or suppose I say Joe removed the silverware from this house. Is that a statement of fact? Would you be likely to say so? Let me move one step more cautiously. Suppose I were to say, at some time between 5 o'clock yesterday afternoon and today, when we uncovered the handprint, Joe was in, on, or around the premises or this room. Would you answer yes to that question? It is a statement of fact that Joe was in or on these premises? And let me try one more. Who put the fingerprints on the wall? Suppose you were to say, Joe put the fingerprints on the wall. Would you consider that a statement of fact? Now, I have run into people who say, yes, of course, that's a statement of fact. How else could the handprints have gotten on the wall? Of course, the silverware was stolen. How else could it go? And when they say, of course it was, how else could it? That begins to introduce for me some distinctions that I should like to pursue a little bit more with you. Now, we had a happening in all these three circumstances. We observed, we assumed, we felt somehow, and we talked. And it is about those statements that I should like to pursue my point now. Is it a statement of fact to say that there are seeds in this apple? I now should like to make a very simple distinction that sometimes in our elementary grammar books we don't make. In English, we can make a statement which is called a declarative statement. And those of you who remember your elementary English grammar books, you remember that they say that a declarative statement is one which asserts a fact. And thus, if I say there are seeds in this, Joe stole the silverware, the penny is in this room, those are all declarative statements. But I now should like to turn things upside down and say that none of these are statements of fact. I should now like to suggest that we tend to believe that most statements which have the declarative form automatically assert statements of fact. And I should like to say that that isn't the case. More sophisticated recent studies of English grammar reveal that we've been oversimplifying things a little too much, and that you can have a declarative statement which is of many sorts, many varieties. For this moment, let me distinguish between two kinds of statements. One I should like to call a statement of fact, and the other a statement involving an inference. And the distinction will be the difference between what we observe or see and what we assume. Now, that word inference is a technical term, but I use it very much the way you would use the word guess, hunch, reckon, opine, believe, suppose, make a hypothesis, theorize. That is, generally, by inference, I mean any of those words. Now, I should like to say this. You can only make a statement of fact after some observation. We can only make a statement of fact after I open the apple. We can only make a statement of fact after we study the whereabouts of the penny. But you can make an inference any time. You can make an inference before we observe, while we observe, after we observe. A second distinction I should like to make. A statement of fact is one which, and let me say this in everyday language, is one which stays with what can be observed, whereas an inference statement is one which goes beyond what can be observed. In other words, I can make some statements of fact that this is round rather than oblong, or I can make some statements of fact about the weight, maybe about the smell and how much it costs and so on. These are things that could be observed. But if I say there are seeds in this, then I'm going beyond what can be observed. I can say that the penny is in this room. But when I say that, we go beyond what we can observe. And then the third thing I should like to say is this, that a statement of fact is as close to certainty as human beings can get. In other words, if we can ever say that anything is certain, it is after we've had some direct experience, some direct acquaintance with it. And the way to indicate that is that inference statements merely show degrees of probability. Perhaps I can make my point by asking you this. How much would you be willing to bet that there are seeds in this? No, I would. I'd be willing. Haven't opened this yet. I'd be willing to give odds of about 10 to 1. But the way to indicate that we are in the realm of probability is to ask, would you bet all you have? Would you bet your life? No, I wouldn't. Once we have opened this, however, and looked in the presence of people, then I think I'd bet all I have. I'd go as far as you would want me to in making statements of fact. But until we have a look, until we've been able to study, anything I say goes beyond. Oh, it's very probable. The odds are very great. And thus I should be willing to bet, and thus I would feel fairly safe but I still would not be certain. And it is that dividing line that we somehow feel is a useful one to have. Now, I'm not sure that the professional magicians of the world are going to approve what I want to do now, but I'd like to show you how I did this, and you must assume that the way I do it now is what I did before. The first time I put the penny on top and turned it, and the penny fell into my hand. But while I did that, I turned this over and put the penny there, then turned my hand, and then did it again, and this time the penny didn't fall. Now, please, make a statement of fact. Where is the penny? Can you make a statement of fact yet? Well, now let's try. The penny stayed there. It stayed on the back. If I were to ask you, why did it stay there, you would make some inference. Maybe it's glue, or I've got a special stickum. Actually, I haven't the time to show you, but there's a tiny magnet in there, and when I place this, it holds fast. Now, presumably, we can make some statements of fact as to the whereabouts of the penny. The penny is, we can say, on the back. And we can be fairly sure, and our statement stays with what is observed and does not go beyond. Now, may I take you very quickly to the answer to my Joe problem. I said, Joe, the silver was stolen. May we have a quick quiz? Is that a statement of fact? No. That's a statement of probability. It goes beyond what we see. Fairly sure. I bet on it, but we don't know. It isn't sure. Suppose I say, Joe was in or around this room last night. Well, that goes beyond what we observed. Suppose I say, Joe put his handprint on the wall. That's still very, very probable, but nobody can make a statement of fact yet. May I tell you very quickly why this is a useful story? I've changed the details a little bit. This is a famous British Scotland Yard case, and I don't think I need to go into details, except that it involves very, very precious silverware and very precious jewels. Scotland Yard sent out an announcement immediately to be on the lookout for this. Some weeks later, a man, let's call him Bill, was apprehended trying to get rid of a piece of the silverware, and under questioning, he broke down and told this bizarre story. He said, Jack and Joe and I had done a number of jobs, and Joe wanted to quit, and I didn't. I wanted to do this one. We had cased the joints, we had studied the situation, and he wanted to quit while we were ahead, and I didn't. We got to arguing about it, and we were under a culvert near a small stream, and he called me a name, and I called him one. He took a poke at me, and I took a poke at him, but I landed, and he hit the corner of the culvert with his skull and stretched out on the ground, and I listened to his heartbeat, and there wasn't any, and he stopped breathing very soon thereafter. And while he was stretched out, I had an idea. That is, I simply then proceeded to remove his left hand, put it in my bag with my other tools. When I got to the house, on my way out, it occurred to me that I might be able to cover up my trail. And as I was leaving, after I had removed the silverware, I took the stump of the hand and jammed it up against the wall, put it back in my bag, went down the road, threw it away near a very small stream, and if you probably look near the culvert, you'll find the Joe with his dismembered left hand. The Scotland Yard proceeded to find the stump and proceeded to verify the story, but the only point I want to make at this moment is this. If I were to say Joe stole the silver, that would be an inference. Very probable, to be sure. If I were to say Joe put his fingerprint on the wall, it was probable. Now we can only say that it is not a statement of fact. And after I've told you this, it was an inference of, in terms of our experience, high probability, but actually we had no way of knowing. Now then, so what is the everyday question? And frequently students in classes will say, why do you bother with this stuff? Okay, so suppose there's a difference. And I should now like to make a point, if I may. And that is that the failure to see this distinction is one of the sources of stupidity and foolishness and difficulties when people engage in human talking. May I put it this way? Let this circle stand for the apple or the penny or the nonverbal facts, the happenings. Then we could make two kinds of statements. And let me number this. 1, 2, 3. Now, obviously, we can always make this kind of a statement if we have a chance to observe, or if we don't have a chance, we make this kind of statement. Now, it is perfectly clear that we couldn't live without making inference statements. I have to make 100 inferences every moment. For example, as I stand here, I must assume that the ceiling won't fall in or the floor won't fall below. And when I had lunch today or yesterday or the day before, I had to make all sorts of assumptions about what was in the food. We couldn't possibly live without going beyond what we see. But to the general semanticist, wisdom begins in our realizing the difference. Because it is when we fail to realize the difference that we are likely to make inference statements as if they were factual statements, and we're likely to make them with the same degree of assurance and vigor as if that vigor belonged to the factual. In other words, it is all right to feel assured and arrogant and positive and certain when we make statements of fact. But when we're in the realm of inference, then when we move here, our behavior ought to indicate the probability inherent. And thus we have found that people tend to make the third statement, to make this kind of statement, as if they were making this sort of statement. May I give you some simple illustrations? President Eliot of Harvard used to tell a story which indicated the distinction in his own way. He once entered a crowded New York restaurant and handed his hat to the doorman. As he came out, he was astonished to see the doorman promptly pick his hat out of the hundreds there and hand it to him. In his surprise, Eliot asked, "How did you know that was my hat?" "Well, I didn't know it was your hat, sir," was the answer. "Why then," asked Mr. Eliot, "did you hand it to me?" Very courteously, the doorman replied, "Because, sir, you handed it to me." And the story goes that President Eliot was delighted with this precise delimitation of what the doorman saw and what he assumed. And sometimes, you see, this behavior leads not to the simple distinction, sometimes it leads to more difficult things. I remember once being in a classroom where a very young teacher was holding forth, and it happened to be the very first day of the school year. I was on a kind of survey committee. We got into her class, and everything was in the usual excitement and chaos of an ordinary first class, and it was the first class of the year, and it was a first grade class. And there was much commotion, but the class got underway, and we noticed that the teacher's attention was caught by a little boy in about the fifth row. She asked them to open their books, and he just sat there. She asked him to close the books, and he didn't pay much attention to her. He was looking out the window, and she asked him to look forward, and he kept looking out the window. The youngsters were playing, and she asked them to go back to their seats. He kept right on playing. She then turned to the party I was with and to me, and she said, "You know, that boy is incorrigible. He's a bad boy. He's impertinent. I'm going to have to deal with him." Now, I remembered my lesson. She saw what she saw. I remember that she told the boy to do something, and he didn't. She told the boy not to do something, and he did. When she proceeds to say, "He's incorrigible, he's bad," she's making an inference. She's going beyond what she sees to make some assumptions about his motives, about why he's doing it. Well, let me get this story on quickly. After the third such experience, she said, "I'm not going to put up with this anymore." She went to the front of the room, pushed a button. I assume a bell rang because in a minute or two, principal came, and she told him the story. He called the boy up, proceeded to ask the boy a question or two, but he didn't get anywhere. Took the boy by the arm, went out. We thought that's where the drama would be, so we followed after. Got into his office. He asked some more questions, and the boy was quite non-committal. He then called the nurse up and said, "What do you make of this?" And I'll stop this story very short. She said, "But, sir, this boy doesn't hear. This boy doesn't hear at all." The principal proceeded to riffle through his basket and found a note from the boy's family physician saying, "We'd like to have the boy in school for a bit. Would you put up with him and let's see how he gets along." Now, I'm interested in the teacher. In the hurry of the day, in the excitement of behaving, we're so busy talking and acting that we don't take the time to scrutinize our own talking. How easy it was for that young lady, harassed as she was, how easy it was for her to assume something about the boy and to act as if she knew. And it is the failure to keep those apart that seemed to me made her extraordinarily unhappy. She was embarrassed, distressed, discomfited, and it wasn't too good for the boy either. From my point of view, if she had said, "That boy is incorrigible," now that's a possibility, that's an inference, it would have made a difference in her behavior. Her behavior qualitatively would be different. Her behavior would be marked by a tentativeness. I think she'd have asked a question. She'd have wondered a little bit. But her behavior was not marked by wonderment. She knew. Let me give you a different kind of story, also a student situation. One of my advisees found he was in trouble, and I received a note from his professor of history saying, please talk to Tom. He's not doing so well. He can't do this history. And I had advised Tom earlier in the year to take classes in history, which I thought he'd be able to do. And I read the professor's note, called Tom in and said, it says here you can't do this history. How come? It says you're not able to do this work. How come? Well, Tom sat back and smiled a little bit and proceeded to tell a story. He was a veteran, returned from the war, had a family, wife, and a youngster, and he was trying to work outside of class for 40 or more hours a week in order to supplement the $125 that Uncle Sam was getting him. And he was having trouble. He looked up at me and said, the money I'm now getting and the money I'm getting from my job, that hardly pays for 3, and we're expecting a 4th. And he looked up at me wryly and said, who's got time to read history? We're too busy making it. Well, from my point of view, think of the professor of history. The professor says, Tom can't do this history. To me, that sounds like a statement of fact. It has the mood of a declarative statement. Tom can't do the history, but it's an inference. It's probable. And I should believe that it would make a world of difference if that professor knew he was in the realm of the probable. If that professor knew that he was going beyond what he observed, his behavior, I think, qualitatively would be different. He would be more likely to wonder. He would say, wait a minute, that's a possible guess. I wonder why. And it is the difference between these two qualitative patterns. My presuming to know, which leads to arrogant behavior, and my wondering about what I know, which leads me to ask, investigate, inquire. Indeed, from one point of view, this is a picture of scientific behavior at its best. The scientist makes inferences galore. He says, I assume something, but he doesn't stop. The man on the street stops. My distinguished historian colleague, he stopped. So did the girl. It is the essence of the scientific mood to go back, to have a look, to see what can be observed. Now, one can find a host of far more complicated, tragic. I have time for just one more quick illustration. This has to do with General Patton and the slap that was heard around the world, the Sicilian slapping incident. It has to do with a private who had been in the Army 8 months, who had trouble at the front. A diagnosis of exhaustion was made. He was sent to the rear, and a note was put on his medical tag stating that he'd been admitted to this place 3 times during the Sicilian campaign. He was evacuated and sent to the rear. On August the 3rd, on his emergency medical tag was this sentence: psychoneuroses, anxiety state, moderately severe. Soldier has been twice before in the hospital within 10 days. He can't take it at the front, evidently. He has repeatedly returned. That's the boy. Explained General Patton, I came into the tent to see this. I spoke to the various patients, especially commending the wounded men. I just get sick inside myself when I see a fellow torn apart, and some of the wounded were in terrible ghastly shape. Then I came to this man and asked him what was the matter. The soldier replied, I guess I can't take it. Looking at the others in the tent, so many of them badly beaten up, I simply flew off the handle. Patton squared off in front of the soldier. He called the man every kind of loathsome coward and then slapped him across the face with his glove. The soldier fell back. Patton grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and kicked him out of the tent. I won't go on. In the hospital, the private was found to have a temperature of 102. He had a history of chronic diarrhea for the past month and was shown by a blood test to have malaria. Please, this is no attempt to cast discredit on a very distinguished soldier. But General Patton's behavior is of the sort that I'm concerned with. The general saw a man. How easy it is in the hurry and excitement and tension of war and peace to say he is a coward. How easy and how inevitable, how factual that sounds. But when one proceeds to analyze that, it is an inference. It's a possibility. To say he's a coward, that's a guess. And thus, I should suppose that the distinction I make is world-shaking. It's a very simple one. For once a man makes it a part of his daily behavior, there is a difference in his mood. He's less arrogant, and he's more willing to probe. I should now like to go on and give you another problem to think about. for my third session. Suppose I were to come up to you and say, I want to say something about Mary. Mary was a sensible and giddy young lady, wise and silly beyond compare. She was a slight and small creature, yet so large that everybody who knew her loved her. She felt rather lonely because she lived in a town with no other houses or people for miles around. But when she did go to visit other people, she was so cheerful that everybody called her the saddest young lady in the country. Now, read that first sentence again. Mary was a sensible and giddy young lady, wise and silly beyond compare. Now, if you were listening to me, or suppose I came into your house or at your desk in an office or came up to you on the street, and I were to say this about Mary, what would be your automatic snap response? What would you be moved to say? Would you be moved to say, that's a lot of nonsense, or you don't know what you're talking about, or you're all mixed up, that's contrary, you're confused, you don't know what you're talking about? Would that be your response? Or would you be likely to say something about Mary? Would you comment perhaps that Mary is an interesting person and one you'd like to know? Or would you wonder how that came about? Or would you proceed to do some inquiring? What would be your response? And it is an attempt to study the way people respond when other people tell them things that are the least bit off the line that will allow me to enter upon the more complicated problem of why is it so easy for people to misunderstand each other? Why is it when someone gives instructions to someone else that those instructions go haywire?
Dr. Irving J. Lee is a teacher of public speaking at Northwestern University. His special field is general semantics, or the ways of talking and thinking which lead to trouble. Dr. Lee is the author of the books How to Talk with People and Language Habits in Human Affairs. On this series of programs, he's making the case for talking sense. Today he begins by asking us the question, why do people misunderstand each other? Mr. Lee.
When we met last time in my previous session, I ended the session with a bit of a problem, and I'd like to repeat it again. If I were to come up to you and were to say something like this, I want to tell you something about a young lady named Mary. Now, Mary was a sensible and giddy young lady, wise and silly beyond compare. She was a slight and small creature, yet so large that everybody who knew her loved her. She felt rather lonely because she lived in a town with no other houses or people for miles around. What would be your reaction? What would be the momentary, automatic response you would be likely to give? We've asked several thousand people this very same question with this kind of example. This is a very simple one. And one can catalog and classify the kinds of responses. Now, I haven't time to describe all of the varieties, but they range between those people who dismiss the speaker. They say, oh, he's all mixed up. He's contradictory. He's talking nonsense. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't know the meanings of words. He's all mixed up. And sometimes they're a little bit less complimentary than that. And then they range all the way down to another category, at the very far end, when people have, as it were, a mood of inquiry. They don't dismiss, but they say, well, now, whatever are you trying to say? What are you after? What are you trying to get across to me? Say it in other words so that I don't misunderstand you. Now, between these two poles of dismissal and inquiry, there are a number of other possibilities, but they are by no means important, because these are the two I should like to focus on. And I might just say at the moment, if you dismiss me, if I come up to you in a hurried situation and say Mary was a sensible and giddy young lady, and you tell me that I'm mixed up, contradictory, my normal reaction is not necessarily to think that you're being friendly or you're being too wise yourself. So that there are some very interesting human dynamic interrelationships that come whenever someone dismisses someone else. And I should like to talk about this phenomenon of dismissal as it relates to the larger problem of understanding and misunderstanding in my remaining session today. Now, I should like to approach an attempt to deal with this kind of difficulty, but perhaps by beginning technically. I'd like to ask you to think with me a little bit about what we know about words. What are some of the most obvious, well-organized, well-agreed-upon characteristics of a language, whether it's English or any other? Well, I can run them down into a series of numbers. Let me begin. In the first place, we can make a distinction between technical terms and non-technical terms. Now, by the technical terms, I mean all those words used in any specialized area in chemistry, physics, TV, the law, and elsewhere, where the range of use of a word will be very narrow. Thus, for example, if I ask for sodium biosulfite, if there's such a thing, in a drugstore in New York City or in San Diego, I'm very likely to get the very same thing. That is, sodium biosulfite is a word with very narrow, limited uses. It's a technical term. We've stipulated, we've decided that the word will have that usage and not very many others. And in the law, there are hundreds of such terms, and in engineering and electricity and physics and so on and so on. But it isn't those words I'm interested in. I'm interested in the hundreds of thousands of others which are the non-technical terms. Now, the non-technical terms are all those that I will be using most of the time in this talk today. They are the words like run and talk and how and feel. That is all of the words which we will be using 95%, or it's almost 99% of our talking time. Now, the peculiar and interesting thing about these words is, take, for example, the word run. Well, it will have many uses. I can talk about running a race or running a mile or home run or sheep run or something having to do with a little boy's nose or colors running or run on a bank or run in a stocking. And each one of these uses is quite different. And the range, we will say, of the uses of the word run will be very broad, whereas the range of a technical term like electron might be very much narrower. Well, that's the first thing we know, that many, many words. Take the word strike, for example. It's used in baseball to miss, in fishing to hit, in labor activities to go away from, in boxing to hit, and so on and so on. The word fast, sometimes in the sense of going in a great rush. Sometimes when we talk about a fast color, we mean staying put in one place. So, my first characteristic, that is the first point. Words may be used in a narrow or wide range, depending. Second thing we know that there are tremendous regional variations in the uses of words. That a word will be used in one part of the country in one way and in another part of the country in another way. I was in a meeting in San Francisco some time back, and in the middle of the morning, our chairman looked up and said, well, I think we've gone far enough. Why don't we interrupt this and go out and have some coffee and snails? And my first impulse was to say, isn't it a little early for that sort of thing? Well, snails in San Francisco, when you ask for them, you get something quite different from what you will get, say, if you ask for them in Chicago. A snail in San Francisco is a wound-up sweet roll that looks very much like a snail. I was in Montgomery, Alabama, some time ago, and talked to a friend of mine who turned to me and said, when the meeting is over, I'll carry you to town. And my first impulse was to say, thanks very much, but can't I go on my own theme? But carry you to town, for him, merely meant the fact that he was offering me a ride in his car. And thus there are regional variations that occur, and perhaps you can think of some in usage. Of course, some of the greatest differences occur between usage in this country and in England. If you travel to Great Britain, for example, you readily discover this tremendous variation. In England, for example, a dessert is a sweet. The waitress will ask you, will you have, what kind of sweet will you have? A cop is very rarely he's a bobby. Garters are suspenders. If you ask for suspenders, you will not get what you're likely to get in a store in this country. Suspenders there are braces. Bloody, I might say, is a curse word in England and is very rarely used in polite company. Taffy is toffee. Syrup is treacle. You have cakes with treacle. Soft drinks are minerals. Think of the range of words we have to talk about soft drinks in this country. A rumble seat is a dicky. The second floor is the first floor. When someone lives on the first floor, you have to climb up. A roller coaster is a switchback railway, and so on and so on. That is one of the very readily recognized things is that words in different parts of the country and even in different jobs, a man in the printing business or in the carpentry business or the TV business will begin to develop a bunch of words that he will use in his own way. A dolly in the TV jargon is not exactly what it will be to a little girl going into the 10-cent store. That is, there's a range of uses, and we're accustomed to that. And, of course, a third thing that we know about words, and that is that words change historically. A word, when Chaucer, for example, talked of having in one of the tales of someone having been to a solemn party, he did not mean the kind of party that we would think he meant. A solemn party for him was one that ended in a drunken brawl. It was a party which became solemn. For us, the usage is quite different. Think, for example, of the changes in possible uses. Just a few centuries ago, when Middle English was spoken, King James once referred to St. Paul's Cathedral as amusing, awful, and artificial. Now, if someone were to call a creation of yours amusing, awful, and artificial, or of mine, I should be disposed not to think too highly of it. But then, that statement was a rare compliment. King James meant that for amusing, he meant amazing. Awful, he used in the sense of awe-inspiring, and artificial, by the word artificial, he meant artistic. And thus he was paying a rare compliment in words which, if used by one of us probably today, would be a rather derogatory kind of insult. Think also of the history of the changes of the uses of words. The word cowboy. The Dictionary of American English gives countless numbers of these fascinating stories, but the word cowboy is of some interest. This was not originally a Western word at all. Before the days of dude ranches, this word was used in an utterly different sense. Indeed, it was an Eastern word used to describe George III's fifth column in the American colonies. The cowboys of the last quarter of the 18th century were Tory sympathizers who wandered through the woods at night ringing cowbells. Unsuspecting American patriots hearing the tinkle would sally forth with lanterns in search of the straying bossies and bessies supposedly attached to the bells and were promptly blitzkrieged by enemy blunderbusses. That is, a cowboy was a Tory fifth columnist, a quisling, a person who sold out. And then one can find some other characteristics of the language. Another one of the characteristics that we're thoroughly aware of is the continuous coinage of new words. That is, in our society, English is growing at a tremendous pace. And the history of the development and creation of new words is an extremely interesting study, of which I can merely touch on at the moment. John Milton, for example, was a famous coiner of words. By the way, the technical word for a word which is coined is a neologism. And most students of language will think of the word neologism in fairly much the same way. But here are some of the words that Milton coined. Dimensionless, infinitude, emblazonry, bannered, anarch, satanic, echoing, irradiant, pandemonium. Mark Twain in this country was a prolific coiner of words. Words, those of you interested in poker may or may not recognize that Mark Twain coined many of the phrases that will be used. Words like passing the buck, four-flushing, sitting pretty, and New Deal. That word New Deal was not one that was coined in the 30s. Indeed, General Sherman back in 1863 once said, Charleston is not taken, the war is prolonged, and but little chance of its ending until we have a New Deal. That's another one of the characteristics. And incidentally, our dictionaries are hard put to keep up. Think of these words which are only in the most recently published American College Dictionary. Super bomb, beanie, canasta, quickie, do-gooder, MC, formica, gin rummy, gobbledygook, hassle, Israeli, king size, Orlan, motel, pollster, and so on. Words which we continuously make up, and that's something I think one ought to think about. And finally, the last of the characteristics of English that I should like to talk about, of course the list is very much longer, is the fact that in English we know how to make differences in tone in our expression. Now, by tone, I don't mean melody. I mean the status of our thought. For example, I have a friend whose daughter was being married recently, and he knew me well enough. He could have called me up to say, hey, Lee, why don't you come Saturday to see my kid get hitched? But no, he didn't do that. He sent me a very handsomely engraved statement on vellum in which he said Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so request the pleasure of your attendance at the nuptials of their daughter, Susan Ann. Now, the difference between these two is one of tone. It isn't one of meaning. The intention may be exactly the same in both cases, but there's a difference in tone. One is not likely in certain circumstances to use certain kinds of words. Thus, for example, I might mean exactly the same thing if I asked you to put out the lights, or douse the glim, or terminate the illumination. That is, these phrases are interchangeable, but I'm not likely to use douse the glim in a studio or in Washington during the war if I wanted somebody to be sure that the lights were turned out. Or I might say, for example, I beat it to the door, I hastily quitted the room, I retired precipitately. I would probably do exactly the same thing, but these statements or phrases are ways of talking about what I did with more or less differences in tone or statement. Now then, what does this all mean? What does it mean to say that we continually create words, that words change historically, that words mean different things at different periods? I think it means only that if we are aware of some of the things we know about language, our attitude towards it might be somewhat more flexible, somewhat less inclined to believe that words are fixed and remain fixed all the time, that words change. They're used differently in different places. Now, this is very old stuff, but we tend somehow to forget it. We tend to forget in the hurry of our talking that words are used in all sorts of ways quite differently. Now, you remember what I said about Mary, if I may go back for the moment. I said Mary was a sensible and giddy young lady. Now, that looks like a contradiction, but if I might explain the kind of ornery stunt that I did, I might say that the word giddy I was using in a very older sense. If you notice it, or spell it out in your mind, you'll notice that it looks very much like godly. And it comes, by the way, from the same stem as God, and used to mean divinely possessed, enthusiastic, and no sense of dizziness or foolishness. And may I say, suppose I was using it in that sense. I merely meant Mary was a sensible and enthusiastic young lady, wise and silly beyond compare. Now, the word silly comes from that German. The word selig means blessed or happy. And of course, as the word language developed, the word came to be used in a satirical sense, according to that wise old philosopher Solon. No man had a right to call himself happy until he was dead. So that accordingly, he who regarded himself as blessed was a fool. In other words, I was using that, and she was a wise and happy. She was a slight and small creature. Now, would you play the game? She was a slight and small creature. It's so large. Might I mean something besides big? Yes, because the word large just for a very long time in the history was used in the sense of generous. We even talk about a person with a large heart. Now, please observe something in the communication situation. Here is a speaker who mentions some words, and here is a listener. Now, there are two things that a listener can do. The listener can interpret the words as he would use them were he doing the talking. Or, and let's call that mode A, or the listener could attempt to interpret the words as the speaker meant them. To put it another way, one of our important difficulties in communication, I believe, arises because listeners tend to do A and never to mind B. Listeners tend to worry about what words mean rather than what the speaker means. We tend to be so taken and so hypnotized by the word itself that we pay no attention to what the speaker means. Now, it might well be that you would think that I was foolish or unwise to use words this way. That's possible, and I shouldn't deny that possible opinion. Nevertheless, when you say I was contradicting myself, you were looking at the meaning of the word giddy as you would be likely to use it. And thus we have a word we call bypassing. I may have been using the word in one way. You proceeded to interpret it another way. And thus we talk past each other. And we find that very, very often listeners tend to believe that speakers are using words as the listener would were the listener doing the talking. And if as a listener you attempt to look at the word apart from me, there is the danger that we will misunderstand each other. Now, sometimes the misunderstanding is frivolous and doesn't mean very much. In Cleveland, Robert Harris, 40, a handyman, was found guilty in traffic court of driving while drunk. $100 in costs, intoned Judge Perry Fry, to be executed by July 2nd. My God, Judge, exclaimed Harris, fainting dead away. When Harris was revived, Judge Fry explained that he was using the word executed as a technical legal term, and he merely meant that Harris had until July 2nd to pay the fine. Here is Harris interpreting the word execute in his way, which is all right. But if you do A without regard for the speaker, then we talk past each other. And sometimes there are the occasions in which this happens are quite frivolous. In New Mexico, when an airline hostess passed out chewing gum with the routine instruction for the ears, a lady passenger later complained, "It worked all right, but couldn't you use something not so sticky?" Well, what does for the ears mean? I should now like to say that that question is of lesser importance to us than what did the young lady mean. To ask the question, what did the word mean, is to put the emphasis on the wrong place in the communication line. I would like to draw another picture. I would like to draw a picture in which listeners are interested in what speakers mean and speakers speak to listeners, rather than someone talking to the word. Or sometimes this is very difficult, and sometimes exceedingly embarrassing. There is a story that came out of the World War, the Second World War. The Army wanted to establish the newspaper Stars and Stripes in Europe, and found a young man named Sergeant Bill E., who was in the Corps of Engineers, and assigned him to the daily newspaper because on his classification card there was recorded his previous experience as the proprietor of a book establishment in Syracuse, New York. Now, it wasn't until several months later that somebody discovered that Sergeant E.'s book establishment didn't deal in fiction and nonfiction, it booked bets on the horses. Now, what does the phrase mean, proprietor of a book establishment? I should like to suggest that that's not as important a question as what did he mean. Now, there is a tremendous qualitative difference between two people talking. If a listener proceeds to say, you use words and they're mixed up, you don't know what you're talking about. The mood is then one of enmity. The mood is one of distance. I should like to develop that kind of human sympathy in which a man would be more moved to wonder, what do you suppose he means? What do you mean? And sometimes I've talked about these in unimportant situations, as trivial, frivolous. Sometimes the consequences are far more devastating. Two examples. One from a biography by David Shub of Lenin. On December the 20th, 1917, Lenin instructed Felix Dzerzhinsky to organize an extraordinary commission for combating counter-revolution and speculation. Dzerzhinsky became the first head of this Soviet secret police. Organized systematic mass terror was the instrument used by the Chekhovs. At meetings of this very high Soviet body, Lenin often exchanged notes with his colleagues. On one occasion, he sent a note to Dzerzhinsky. How many vicious counter-revolutionaries are there in our prisons? Dzerzhinsky's reply was about 1,500. Lenin read it, snorted something to himself, made a cross beside the figure, and returned the note to D. D rose and left the room without a word. No one paid any attention either to Lenin's note or to D's departure. The meeting continued. But the next day, there was excited whispering. D had ordered the execution of all the 1,500 vicious counter-revolutionaries. The previous night, immediately after leaving the room, he had taken Lenin's cross as a collective death sentence. There would have been little comment had Lenin's gesture been meant as an order for wholesale liquidation. But as Potyeva, Lenin's secretary, explained, there was a misunderstanding. Lenin never wanted these executions. Dzerzhinsky simply didn't understand him. Lenin usually puts a cross on memoranda to indicate that he has read them and noted their contents. Well, an occasion in which 1,500 men are destroyed because someone presumes that X means something. Now, words don't mean, only a person does. There is no meaning in a word. We sometimes talk about this as the container myth. Now, you can put something in a glass, water, dirt, sand, anything. A glass will hold something. And we can talk about this as a container. A word, however, is not a container in the way a glass is. The container of meaning is a man, a woman. It's you. It's you listening. It is I talking. It is I listening. It is you talking. A word doesn't mean for Dzerzhinsky to look at X and act as if that meant wipe them out, that is to look, incidentally, to think of how many different ways we use the word X in our society. X marks the spot. X is sometimes the signature of a man who can't write his name. X is at the bottom of a letter, a number of X's, an indication of goodwill and friendliness. That is, the word X doesn't mean anything, but in our approach to language, we have a tendency to think that a word is a self-containing center of meaning. It isn't. Words are sounds in the air, marks on the blackboard. Meaning is in you and in me. And thus, when Dzerzhinsky proceeds to respond to the X, he behaves in the mood A. He pays no attention to what the speaker may mean. Another illustration, which perhaps comes slightly more closely to our time. This appears in Secretary James Burns' book, Speaking Frankly. In a private conversation with Mr. Molotov, he says, it became apparent that another difficult problem had arisen between ourselves and the Russians. At the San Francisco conference, when the question of establishing a trusteeship system within the UN was being considered, the Soviet delegation has asked Mr. Stettinius what the American attitude would be toward the assumption by the Soviet Union of a trusteeship. Mr. Stettinius replied in general terms, expressing the opinion that the Soviet Union was eligible to receive a territory for administration under trusteeship. Mr. Molotov took this to mean that the U.S. would support a Soviet request for a trusteeship. Now, what does the word eligible mean? To me, that question isn't entirely sensible. What did Mr. Stettinius mean? Now, sometimes we use the word eligible. I suppose any of us is eligible to try out if you're an American citizen for the Olympic track team. But that doesn't mean you will get a place on the team. When Mr. Molotov asked, was the Soviet Union eligible? Mr. Stettinius replied, yes, you're eligible to ask for it, but that doesn't mean we'll get it. And then several months later, when it came to a vote, the United States voted against, giving the Russians one of the trusteeships, whereupon Mr. Molotov's equal proceeded to arise and speak devastatingly about the United States' refusal to honor its promises and obligations. And I should suggest that it makes a difference what a man means far more than that we pay attention to the word. In practice, this means a great deal. In our studies of the behavior and relationship between parents and children, children try to say things. And parents sometimes, in a hurry, impatient, proceed to dismiss them. We urge a very interesting kind of delay. We urge patience and attempt to discover what is on his mind. Incidentally, we've come to a quite different attitude about what we mean by a boner. We find very few boners nowadays. For example, a teacher in the classroom, in the civics class, the teacher says, who officiates when the president dies? And Johnny in the fifth or sixth row raises his hand and says, the undertaker. And the teacher proceeds to bawl him out. Now, that may be a boner from one point of view. From another point of view, Johnny interpreted his way. The teacher was interpreting it her way. And somewhere in the educational training, growth programs of young and old people, I should think it would be of enormous value if somewhere we got a sharp sensitivity of the fact that if we would understand a man, we must go way beyond his words. It becomes necessary to await patiently, to wonder what he means. Normally, if there is misunderstanding, we tend to blame the speaker. We tend to say he should have spoken more plainly. I now have come to believe that it is exceedingly difficult, no matter how simply a man speaks, for him to be misunderstood unless listeners seek to understand him. Incidentally, there is a game that can be played. We do not have time to play it in this session, and perhaps in the others, but it merely is this. If I want to misunderstand you, there is no set of instructions that you can give me that possibly can keep me from it. If I proceed to interpret your words in my way, it is very exceedingly difficult for you to do anything about it. And thus, we come finally to that tremendous conclusion that communication is a two-way process. It involves two people. Communication is not just one man talking. It is not one man listening. It involves two. And I suppose if we could come to any conclusion that makes more sense in the human communion process than any other, it is that it takes two to make communication. It takes a willing listener, and it takes a speaker eager to make himself understood. But in the hurry of the day, it is so easy for most of us to forget that as we pay too much attention to the words that we use.
When we say that one of the greatest barriers to peace and tranquility in this world is the inability of one man to make himself clear to another man, what do we mean? Dr. Irving J. Lee, professor of speech at Northwestern University, is professionally concerned with that problem as he teaches his courses in general semantics. He is bringing to these programs a discussion of the matter of communications and understanding as he takes up the problem of talking sense. Today he asks this question: what is a good observer? Dr. Lee.
The problem of the good observer, as distinguished from the poor observer, is a very old one, and I'm not entirely sure that I can say too many new things about it. Think very roughly and very generally with me for a moment, would you? A good observer, how do you distinguish him from a poor one? It would have been interesting, perhaps, in this session, if I could have brought some dialogue between Dr. Watson and Sherlock Holmes. You recall the many occasions when Dr. Watson will look and not see very much, and then Mr. Holmes will proceed to look and uncover a great number of details about the thing or the person they were looking at. Now, in an attempt to describe the difference between a good observer, is he one who merely sees more details? Does he remember things he saw? Does he see nuances, tiny subtleties? What's the difference between a good and a poor observer, and what has that to do with the business of talking sense? I'd like to approach this question through a kind of round-the-barn approach so that I might come in by the back door. Would you, as a way then of approaching this through the back door, think of a very small demonstration or game with me? Suppose I ask you to look at this, please, and then, if you can do this mentally or out loud or silently, it doesn't make any difference, answer this question, please. The question is, what do you call what you see? What do you call what you see on this chart? And it would be fun and a great deal of interest if I could find out some of the things that you all are saying to yourselves. What might some of the things be? Let me describe what many, many hundreds of people have said when we give stimuli, something like this. They will say geometric design, drawing, figures, shapes, geometrical design, black marks on a white background, figures, drawing, doodling, modern art. All of these words I perhaps would put in group one. And let me just write as a summary of these just the word design, designs or figures. Then we find that a lot of people will say something like this. They will say, I see a variety of shapes. And I would put that in category 2 just as a way of making a simple distinction. A variety of shapes. Or they will say, I see some different figures up here. Or they say, I see a number of quite different things, where the idea of some variety or some difference comes in. The word various may sometimes be used. Then in category 3, sometimes people will say things like, I see straight and curved lines. Or I see straight and curved lines. I see open and closed figures. I see regular and irregular figures. In other words, that's a category. And then we sometimes run onto people who will indicate these individually. They will write or think or say to themselves, circle, triangle, square, whorl, rectangle, and so on. They will name them individually, and they will say, I see 10 figures, including a circle, a triangle, a square, a right angle triangle, and so on. In other words, they notice the respect in which each of these is an individual item. In other words, may I very quickly indicate that the answers we get to this kind of a little game indicate that some people will emphasize the respect in which these are similar. They note the similarities, their design. And as we go from 1 to 4, some people note the differences. That is, they note that there are peculiar, differentiating things up here, and they notice the differences between them. When we do this with several thousand people, the great percentage of them are in 1 or 2. See, very, very often, about 80% of any group will be here, and only about 5% will be in category 4. So what do these bits of data mean? And there are many illustrations that I could give you which indicate that the tendency when one gives people a number of things like this is to use the word figures, shapes, a word which emphasizes the respect in which they're all similar. Now that's very curious from one point of view, because one of the things that it is very easy to demonstrate is that in the world in which you and I live, no two things, no two happenings, no two circumstances, no two situations, as one of my students said, no two nothings are exactly alike in all respects. No two cigarettes that you take from a package of cigarettes, no two nails, no two dimes hammered out at the mint have ever been exactly alike in all respects. Each one of them was different from each other in some way, in some small item or in some detail or some aspect. To say it another way, I can't write my name twice exactly the same way, and I venture to assume that you can't either. So far as I know, nobody has. I can't walk 2 steps exactly the same way. I can't say the same word the same way twice and make the same electrical impression on a gadget. I can't strike middle C on the piano twice and produce the same number of vibrations and the same effect on a measuring machine. No 2 inches of wool on a strand that came out of the same dyeing vat will have exactly the same color. No 2 hairs on my head, no 2 centimeters of any one strand of hair exactly alike. If one takes a pistol and fills it with cartridges, with shells, proceeds to shoot them all, then analyzes the cartridges, no 2 of the bullets will have exactly the same markings. In other words, one of the things that is very easy to demonstrate is that in the world in which we live, things are never exactly alike. I better say, we have so far not found any 2 of anything exactly alike. No 2 photographs taken of exactly the same situation will be exactly alike. No 2 drawings, no 2 pressings of records from the same master copy will be exactly alike. No 2, in short, if I may repeat myself, no 2 of nothing have ever been found to be exactly alike in every conceivable respect. In short, we're led to an interesting conclusion that nature never quite repeats herself. Well, what difference does that make? So what, I suppose, is the obvious question. There are differences in the world, but of course we can see similarities. Please observe that every one of the items on my original chart, each one of these was different from the other in some respect. There was a difference, and what we tend to do is to submerge the differences the moment one starts to talk. Now I must ask the question, of what value is it that we see similarities? Well, it's rather easy to describe those. If we couldn't see the similarities, we would never learn anything. The teacher teaches how to do an arithmetic problem. The teacher then gives the class an arithmetic assignment. If the youngsters couldn't learn to see the similarities, they wouldn't learn anything. Furthermore, think how expedient and convenient and easy it is. Very quickly we say, these are figures. These are designs. That is, we wrap them all together. It's very, very easy. And then, in the third place, it is the seeing of similarities between things that superficially look different that is the essence of wisdom and the mark of insight. So we couldn't get along unless we talked in the patterns of 1 and 2 and 3. But now, of what value would it be if we saw differences in the world? Well, I should like to say that it is the mark of sophistication to be able to see differences. I remember being in the garden of a friend of mine who had many, many, many dahlias. And he had 3 rows of white dahlias. And I asked very stupidly, what's the reason for all of these dahlias which are exactly alike? I shan't repeat his sarcastic comment, but it was to the effect that I simply was too unsophisticated to see the differences. That is, I was the amateur, the tyro, and they all looked alike to me. And it is the inability to see the differences that is the mark of the uneducated, the unsophisticated person. The trained person, the person who sees the differences, he knows whether it is one great pianist playing the piece or another great pianist. One knows whether the writing was done by a 19th century person or a 16th century person. The seeing of the difference is the mark of sophistication. And from one point of view, I should also like to argue that it is also the ultimate earmark of what we mean by training. What we mean by training is the man who ultimately can tell the difference. The woodsman is trained to see all of the variations. The track coach is trained to see that a boy who does it this way won't succeed and a boy who does it that way will. It is because he sees the difference that you go to the golf pro or to any teacher. Indeed, it is the ability to pick out differences that is what you mean by the man who makes the test. I once sat in on it with a group of people testing coffee, and there were 20 or 30 small cups with very small amounts. I could only distinguish 4 or 5 varieties. My distinguished friends were able to make many, many distinctions, and it was a mark of their distinction that they could make the distinctions which the unsophisticated person didn't. Now then, my point, I suppose, can be summarized in a nutshell. I want to suggest that when people tend to see similarities only or exclusively, then we get into trouble. And that it is the mark of the mature man who sees differences and similarities, who sees similarities among things that are different, and who sees differences when the unsophisticated see similarities. Now, if I may, I would like to put this in somewhat more generalized terms. May I define a good observer? And let me please try to explain this diagram. Note some very simple angles. And here is an angle with a curve underneath. Now suppose I were to make a statement about each item. I would say I would talk about that, and I would talk about this one, and about this one. I would talk about each one. And if I wanted to, I might make a conclusion statement in which I took every item into account. I would talk about, in other words, let's say I was talking about those dahlias. I looked at this one and that one and that one, so that my statement took all of them into account. And then if I wanted to take some action, I would take some action on the strength of that conclusion. Now, may I compare that good observer with a poor observer? What's he like? Well, he has the same stimuli, and he makes item statements about some of the entities, and then he draws a conclusion on some, and let's call that a limited conclusion. Let's say I, for example, ate a certain kind of fish, and I ate one kind of fish and ate another, ate another, and then suppose my conclusion happened to be those fish are not tasty. Then suppose you presented me, or I came upon, this additional item with the circle. Suppose now I went to sit down in front of it with my conclusion, these fish are unpleasant. Then my reaction to this one would tend not to be in terms of its uniqueness. My reaction would tend to be to it in terms of my previous judgment. And thus I would have not a conclusion based on all of the details, but a conclusion based on some of them. And thus my behavior might be quite different. Now may I take this out of the realm of the generality and see if I can get slightly more specific. But just as a way of indicating that it is extremely easy and widespread for us to lump all things together and to think in terms of similarities. I'm reminded of a story that Lord Halifax once told while amusing a banquet audience in Washington during the war. It was a story of a tramp ship with a heterogeneous passenger list stranded on an idyllic Polynesian islet. And as he tells the story, soon the little spot was a beehive of activity. The Germans were drilling the natives into an army. The Americans opened a general store and an auto agency. The Australians started a racetrack. The French a restaurant. 2 Scots were financing the whole show, and a couple of Englishmen were still standing around waiting to be introduced. That is, it is easy to talk about Scotsmen and Americans and Englishmen, and it's easy to lump them all together. And it is exceedingly easy not to notice the differences, the peculiarities, the individuality, the uniqueness of each of the members of this great group. Now may I come back to my distinction between the poor observer and the good observer to see if I can point out that our habits of talking in a way reflect the way we observe. And if we could change our observing, we might change our patterns of talking and vice versa. But now let's come on back to the poor observer. He's a man who has a few experiences. He comes to a conclusion. He then brings his conclusion to bear on the new one so that he hardly sees the new characteristic. A simple example. This is from a novel by Willard Motley entitled Knock on Any Door. And in the example, Nick Romano, the young boy who appears throughout the story, we meet him after he has had some trouble with the police. And he had trouble with cops, if you forgive that indignity. And he had met 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of them, and they had treated him fairly severely, so that as a result of that, he said, this cop didn't treat me so good, this one, and he draws a conclusion, cops are no good. And then comes the story. At the corner of 12th Street stood the old policeman. He was always there during school hours to help the youngsters across the wide thoroughfare. He'd stop traffic with an upstretched hand when there were a bunch of kids waiting on the curb to see that they got across safely. And sometimes he had candy stuffed down in his pockets to give them, or pennies. He was a big man with a round middle under his large blue coat. Now, up in front of Nick, the kids were running to meet the policeman. Hello, Mr. O'Callahan. Hello, Mr. O'Callahan, they all shouted at once, half singing the words. Nick came to the curb and stepped down. Will you wait a minute, lad, O'Callahan called. What? Nick answered with hostility. Old O'Callahan stood with one foot on the curb. He hoisted himself up on the sidewalk. Phew, he said, blowing air. Sure, and the devil is in me feet. Nick's eyes lowered sullenly. Cops ain't no good. You're a new lad, ain't you? None of them. Yes. Old O'Callahan put his hand in his pocket, saying, "'Tis the new lads you're in the neighborhood," and pulled out a baseball. Would you be interested in a baseball, lad? Sure, and I got it at Wrigley Field. I caught it myself. Now, what would I be doing with a baseball? There's a little fat around the middle that I'm getting. He patted his belly. 'Twas a good catch for a man my size. He chuckled good-naturedly, went on. 'Twas hit by Gabby Hartnett, another good Irishman. Nick didn't take the outstretched ball. Old O'Callahan looked surprised. Now, what's the matter with you? Take it. You play the game, don't you? No, Nick said. Nick started across the street. Here, take it anyway, O'Callahan called, making a motion as if to toss it underhand to him. Your friends can use it. Keep it, cop, Nick said over his shoulder as he went on. Now, from my point of view, how is one to understand Nick? Nick, from my point of view, is an exceedingly poor observer. He meets cop 1, cop 2, cop 3, a number of them. He comes to a conclusion, cops ain't no good. And then suddenly, he comes on O'Callahan. Now, in the story, O'Callahan is friendly, wants to give him a baseball, wants to talk with him, in a mood utterly different from the policeman. But Nick doesn't see him. Nick doesn't see him at all. Nick is thinking in terms of similarities. Cops are all alike. Nick is, in a sense, far too imprisoned by his assumptions that policemen are all alike. So that Nick never really faces this man. And we've learned in training people, because in English we have so many words that emphasize similarities, we learn words like cops and cars and houses and teachers and Americans and so on. And we've learned the habit of putting a little index, a little number, so that we talk about cop 1 and cop 2 and cop 3 and so on. In other words, for Nick, cops were all alike. There were no differences. Think, if you will, of the dozens and dozens of daily situations that it would be possible to talk about. That is, little Johnny is in an arithmetic class, and the teacher is, let's say, not entirely sympathetic or not entirely friendly. Johnny comes home. What does he say? Does he say, the teacher in this arithmetic class was unpleasant and unfriendly? If you listen closely, you may hear Johnny saying, teachers are unfriendly. I can't do arithmetic. Arithmetic classes are no fun. That is, Johnny immediately neglects the individual. Johnny immediately moves to limited conclusions so that when Johnny gets into an arithmetic class in another year, he may, unless he's grown wiser and sophisticated so he sees differences, he may tend to look upon the new arithmetic teacher in terms of the devastating experience of the old. Or, what we find even more often, Johnny won't even go into the arithmetic class if he can help it. Now, in school, we have control over him. But think of the larger human relations, how we tend not to observe, how we tend not to be willing to observe the peculiarities of what's involved. I've run onto many situations in minority relations among human beings. A man will have an experience with a member of a minority group. It makes no difference who the minority group is. He will have an experience with one man, with another, with a third, and then listen to him talk. Does he say, that particular member of a minority group pushed me in the subway or the streetcar or on the street? Does he say that? Or does he say, those fellas? The tendency is to lose sight of the individual. The tendency is to neglect the differences. And from my point of view, one, I suppose, of the deepest steps that one can take in the development of human sensitivity is to discover the differences between things. There is a slogan that may somehow be relevant. It is, we tend to discriminate against people to the degree that we fail to distinguish between them. And the discovery of the difference becomes somehow liberating. Now, in English, it is very easy to speak in generic terms. By that I mean, it is very easy to emphasize the respect in which things are alike. For example, other people do not find it as easy to be as generic and emphasize similarities as much as we do. For example, in the American Indian language, the Mohican, there are, I'm told, different words for cutting various objects. There is a word to cut a tree, and there is another word to cut your finger, and there is another word to cut meat from the side of a steer. But there is no word in Mohican for cutting. In Mohican, there is a well-designed sense of the difference. There is no word for the similarity cutting. Among the Cherokee, for example, there are 13 quite different verbs to denote particular kinds of washing, but there is no verb in Cherokee to denote washing as such. It isn't possible, I imagine, I am told, for one Cherokee lady to meet another and, speaking Cherokee, to say, have you done your washing? As we can. If you mean clothes, you have to use a verb for clothes. If you mean have you done washing of the youngsters, you have to use a separate word. In English, the emphasis on similarities is so great, it is so devastating, that it is almost easier to talk in terms of similarities. No, let me say that differently. It is as easy to talk in similarities as the effort is required to bring out the differences. In other words, it is easy for me to go to downtown into a store and meet a salesgirl behind the counter. And if she says to me, if she's difficult and impertinent and impatient, it is far easier, and I am far more likely to go home and tell somebody, you know, those salesgirls downtown are exceedingly unpleasant. It takes an active scrutiny, an active insight, an active discrimination for me to say, that particular girl behind the counter ill-treated me. Now, understand, I'm perfectly willing to recognize that there are some statements that can be made, and made with great acuity, about great masses of things. Yes. But the moment one talks about masses of things, there is a tendency to neglect the differences. There is a tendency to neglect the specifics, the variety, the nuances, the kind of richness that there is in the world. And finally, when one talks in terms of similarities, the tendency is to see a little bit less. We go into the forest and we see trees. The next time you do, would it be interesting to say, I saw tree 1 and tree 2 and tree 3 and tree 4? Instead of going to the museum and trying to see the pictures, wouldn't it be interesting if the next time one tried to see picture 1 and looked at it, and then saw picture 2 and all of the things that inhere in it? And it is this attempt to discover the differences that we find sometimes exerts a very protective effect on the varieties of stupidity that I frequently find. And of course, there is one other and sharper reason why we tend to see similarities quite apart from our training. And that is, our behavior tends to be so hasty. It is so easy and so relatively easy to talk about the similarities where it takes an active effort to notice the differences. There are many illustrations. May I just give you one final one? This is a story about a boy named White who went to work for the B Company. He was put in the shipping room packing unfinished castings into boxes. The castings had rough edges and had to be handled with leather gloves. Soon the raw edges would wear down through the gloves and onto knuckles, and since that was so, sticks were used to tamp down the straw that was placed around the casting. Now, the boy wore out a couple of tamping sticks a day and had to cut new ones out of scrap lumber. One afternoon, he was leaning against the shipping case, whittling a smooth handle on a new tamping stick. The new plant superintendent came in on his first visit to the shipping department. He was interested in efficiency. When he saw young White, he glared at the lad, nodded his head threateningly. The boy jumped to his feet to tell about the tamping stick, but the superintendent spoke first. So you think you can get by with loafing and whittling on the job, eh? Just because nobody ever comes to the shipping room, you're fired right now. Get out. It would be possible to think of the superintendent as a person who wasn't observing the particular, unique, peculiar characteristics of this situation. I assume that in other occasions when the superintendent saw boys whittling, he came to a conclusion, whittling a stick means he's wasting time. He's costing the company money. And with that conclusion, he proceeds to look at the boy White. Now, there is a very real sense in which I think it could be said that the superintendent never really looked at White at all. What he did was to see him in terms of the image of similarity which he had seen before. And if we go through life seeing the image of similarity in all things, we very rarely read anew. We very rarely see anew. We very rarely hear anew. And thus, if one would talk sense, there comes to be wisdom and insight in the attempt to achieve insight in the direction of differences. And thus, it might be a very interesting thing for you to try as you walk down the street today or tomorrow to see what differences you see.
At Northwestern University, this man is a professor of speech. His name is Dr. Irving J. Lee, whose special area of interest is general semantics, the ways of talking and thinking which lead to trouble. Dr. Lee is the author of 2 books in the field, How to Talk with People and language habits in human affairs. Today we meet him for the 5th time as he nears completion of his discussion of the problems of talking sense. Here's Mr. Lee to speak on the differences between words and things.
Suppose you play a very small game with me. And then suppose I were to throw this piece of chalk to you, and you caught it. And then suppose I were to say, what did I throw you? How would you answer my question? Now, there are some automatic, obvious ways of answering my question. And when I've done this with many, many students and games somewhat more sophisticated than this, trying for the same objective, most people will reply with a statement. What did I throw you? A piece of chalk, or a round, long, cylindrical object, or an object with which you write on the blackboard, or something made of calcium carbonate. Or what did I throw you? An object that you can buy in the store that was produced someplace. And then I will ask the student, is there any other way that you could answer my question without doing it with these words? Because when you give me words in answer to my question, it is possible for me to say, when you say a piece of chalk, for me to say, no, I didn't. I didn't throw you a piece of chalk. And at this point, frequently, my students look at me with dismay and wonderment. What happened to him? Where was he last night? But there is a very important sense in which I could say, no, ma'am, no, sir, I did not throw you a piece of chalk. Those are words. I didn't throw you the words piece of chalk or the words cylindrical object. What I threw was something which is not a word, but which words point to. I threw you, and sometimes it's good to say, maybe we ought to keep still for a moment and look. And thus, were you to play my role, reverse our roles, and were you to say to me, what did I throw you? Instead of answering piece of chalk, I would have my choice of saying, that is, there are two ways of answering a question, a verbal way and a nonverbal way. And when Johnny asks an adult, Dad, what's the moon? You have two choices. You can give him a lot of words, or you can take him by the hand and proceed the point. That is, there is a verbal way and a nonverbal way. Now then, you and I live in the kind of society, the kind of cultural organization, where we put a tremendous premium on becoming vocal and on talking almost from birth. Notice how readily adults talk to infants when the infants are in the crib. For most of us, we are surrounded with words and with talking almost from the moment of our birth. Now, not all people are. You may remember when Helen Keller writes the story of my life, there is just one small dramatic moment that I should like to read about. She says, the most important day I remember in all my life is the one on which my teacher, Anne Mansfield Sullivan, came to me. I'm filled with wonder when I consider the immeasurable contrast between the two lives which it connects. It was the 3rd of March, 1887, 3 months before I was 7 years old. And I'll skip. The morning after my teacher came, she led me into her rooms and gave me a doll. When I had played with it a little while, Miss Sullivan slowly spelled into my hand the word D-O-L-L. I was at once interested in this finger play and tried to imitate it. When I finally succeeded in making the letters correctly, I was flushed with childish pleasure and pride. I did not know that I was spelling a word, or even that words existed. In the days that followed, I learned to spell in this comprehending way a great many words, among them pen, hat, cup, and a few verbs like sit, stand, and walk. But my teacher had been with me several weeks before I understood that everything has a name. And I'll skip some more. We walked down the path to the well house, attracted by the fragrance of the honeysuckle with which it was covered. Someone was drawing water, and my teacher placed my hand under the spout. As the cool stream gushed over one hand, she spelled into the other the word water, first slowly, then rapidly. I stood still, my whole attention fixed upon the motions of her fingers. Suddenly, I felt a misty consciousness as of something forgotten, a thrill of returning thought, and somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew then that W-A-T-E-R meant the wonderful, cool something that was flowing over my hand. And she goes on. And the only point I should like to make is a very simple one. For Miss Helen Keller had to wait until she was 7 before she recognized that words existed. For us, we sometimes are astonished to realize that there are many adults who grow to adulthood somehow seemingly unaware, in the presence of all the great torrent of words to which we're subjected, that there are things as well as words. And that very often we never bother to answer our questions, and lots of other things too, by looking to the facts, which are not words. So engrossed, so enmeshed, so imprisoned are we in the atmosphere of the verbal in which we live so much of the time. Indeed, there are for many people far more deeply organized responses to words than to things which are not words. Now, I remember a very homely example myself. I was at a dinner party in Florida, and our host was a very generous person who had supper served buffet style on his veranda, and there were many plates full of succulent dishes, and people sampled widely and well, and after eating, we sat around in a semicircle on the veranda looking out to the Atlantic Ocean, and our host came in with a kind of roguish glint in his eye. He turned to everybody and said, everybody, did you taste the food in the silver platter in the center of the table? And everybody had. And then he looked up and said, what do you suppose that stuff was? Well, my guess was it may have been cold chicken or cold pork, and the guesses ranged around that. It was some sort of conventional food. Well, after everybody had guessed this, he turned and said, snake steaks. And I remember vividly a young lady at the far end of the semicircle who turned an ashen grayish green, and then had the unhappy experience of seeing her dinner for the second time. Now, please note, she ate the food, she digested it, it was becoming part of her, and her response was normal, conventional, ordinary. But when someone said snake steaks, her response to the words was exceedingly dramatic and cataclysmic. It almost looked to me as though, for her, the word is a stimulus for far deeper effects than the food itself. And we're astonished to discover so often, and the evidence is very great, that people sometimes see utterly differently under the influence of a word. It's a very simple demonstration test that we sometimes give. It consists of a big sheet of paper with daubs of color spread on about a foot long, and there are various colors, and we ask subjects to rank them according to the pleasantness and unpleasantness. If it's number 1 down to 10, and we'll do this 2 or 3 times with the same people to see if they are regularizing their ranking. Then we will give about some weeks later the same set of colors, but this time each color is accompanied by a word, an adjective, like mottled yellow, meadow gold, bilious green, crude, faded, warm sandstone. And then we discover, when we ask the people to rank them again, the rankings change. They tend to rank the colors in terms of the pleasantness or unpleasantness of the associations around the words, more with the result that they tend to like colors they liked before, they now tend to dislike. So that from one point of view, if a person is more interested in the associations surrounding the words, and his response is more dramatic to them than to the fact the words stand for, that may well be one variety of unrealistic behavior. And it may be that if we pursue this, we'll have a definition of what it means to be realistic. I'd like to show you a map. This is a map that was just made in fun. It was sort of a game. Some of my Texan friends may enjoy it. It's a Texan's view of the United States, in which Texas looms large and wonderful and enormous. This is made in fun. It's a jest. Whether the jest has any significance or not is unimportant. But the map allows me to make a point on this word things business that I should like to pursue. Note what the map did. It exaggerated tremendously. We find it very helpful to think of words and talking as a kind of continuous map-making. Thus, just as a map can fit the territory, what I say about anything can fit it. If, for example, I say that this is not cylindrical, it's five-dimensional or something of the sort, my math may not fit. Or if I say that there are three of these, my language does not fit. Now, one of the very interesting effects, we think, that comes from our failure sharply to realize when we're in the realm of the verbal and when we're in the realm of the nonverbal is the deeply ingrained, exaggerating tendency that occurs in our speech. And I should like to try to provide one or two illustrations of how easy it is for us to exaggerate in our talking, just as it's easy for a math maker to distort a math. Indeed, to make an accurate math is a very great achievement. It takes countless observations and a great deal of very technical work to make a math fit the territory. I now want to suggest that in our everyday talking, we are more likely to distort and exaggerate than we think. And secondly, that it will take an active effort to be accurate and precise and to avoid the exaggeration. And I'd like to show you this in two or three very simple ways. Suppose, for example, I were to ask you a very simple question about some great figure. Say, for example, I were to say to you, what are some of say something about Wendell Willkie's political philosophy. And I were to ask several people at once, what are some of the things they're likely to say? Oh, when I ask someone that, he's likely to say, Wendell Willkie believed in one world. And I would write that out, in one world. Or Wendell Willkie was a great Republican. Or they're likely to say Wendell Willkie had a philosophy that would remove the power from the federal government, or something. In other words, we will make a quickly categorizing statement. Thus, for example, if I were to say to you, say something about Shakespeare as a playwright. You might say, Shakespeare was a great playwright, or something. Shakespeare was a man who introduced poetry, great poetry, into his plays. Now, I want to argue, as for the moment, that the form of this sentence is enormously exaggerating because it doesn't take into account something that is very easy to demonstrate. May I show you? May I give you a one-minute biography of Wendell Willkie, which is enormously oversimplifying, and I trust you'll take that into account. But between 1910 and 1914, Wendell Willkie was an undergraduate at Indiana University. And during that period, he was editor of a very irreverent magazine called Bogus. And in Bogus, all sorts of articles severely critical of the faculty were regularly printed. In addition, Mr. Willkie, in his first 2 years, was a debater. And one of the subjects debated widely was the abolition of inheritance. And there is evidence to indicate that Mr. Willkie, by choice, debated on the side which said that inheritances should be abolished. He didn't think it fair for some boys and girls to start out with more income than their friends. He opposed the fraternities, fought them furiously, because he once said the Greeks, meaning the fraternities, get most of the breaks on the campus, and that isn't fair. Nevertheless, in his last year, he joined one of the very largest ones. He graduated, went to law school, came out of law school, did some campaigning in the 20s for a man who was elected to Congress, but who was badly smeared and discredited in some congressional investigations. And let's take Mr. Willkie through the 20s into the early 30s, where he was essentially a public relations man for several, at least winding up one very great public utility. That is, he was in the worst possible sense, I could say, a front man. He was a public relations figure. He was not the kind of businessman that ran the company. He gave speeches and so on. And then came his campaign for the presidential office, running against Mr. Roosevelt. And then finally, after his defeat, his travel around the world. Now, if you will permit me to be very loose, I think it could be said that in his undergraduate years at Indiana, Mr. Willkie was a young progressive, a very liberal young man. That is, he was a young maverick, exceedingly critical. In his 20s and 30s, he was an exceedingly conservative, you might almost say reactionary person. Then in the late 30s, I think you could say he ran on a very liberal Republican platform. And then in his last 2 years, after the trip around the world, you could say that he was almost spiritually kin to the New Deal. You could almost say that when he returned from his round-the-world trip. Now, it is easy to say, Mr. Wendell Willkie believed in one world. But when I say that, what is implied? Mr. Willkie believed in one world when? What seems to be lurking around the corners of the phrase, he believed in one world? May I add the omitted phrase, all the time. He believed in one world all the time. When I say something about Shakespeare. Shakespeare wrote great poetry. The implication is all the time. But any look at the man, any look at the plays, will indicate that Wendell Willkie was a man who changed. He went from exceeding liberalism to exceeding conservatism to something else. But it is easy to catch Mr. Willkie in a phrase to say he believed he was a good Republican. But that doesn't begin to catch the variety and the variations. And if you will watch the kinds of talking around you, note how easy it is to peg someone. To say, Johnny is a bad boy. And note how hard it is for a person to bring in, he's a bad boy when? Well, this afternoon when he tried to saw the legs off the piano at home. But when we say Johnny is a bad boy, note how there seems to be hidden all the time. And in our studies of how people behave with each other, a supervisor who comes to say, that man's lazy, he's pegged, and then from that point on, it takes an active effort for that supervisor to realize he's lazy in these periods when I knew him. But unless we put the date on there, unless we say when, the implication is all the time. Every now and then I do some elementary conversations, counseling with advisees that I have at the university. And I remember vividly one kind of problem that I see over and over. Something happened to a boy or a girl. He failed some courses. He had some social difficulties. He lost his job or something. Let me just talk about one of them, typical of many. He came to my office. He looked at me and he said, I want to leave school. I want to quit. I'm a failure. I can't do it. He says, I'm a failure. It's very easy to hear the overtones. I'm a failure now and for all the time. And invariably, in these circumstances, I will say, you're a failure when? And invariably, one of these youngsters will say, what do you mean when? I'm a failure. I will say, when? My whole attempt being to break him of the exaggerating tendency, I am a failure for all time. Because we have come to believe, if you say, I am a failure for all time, the depth of your distress will be far greater and deeper than if you say, I'm a failure this year. And part of what constitutes therapy, part of what constitutes release for this boy, is to make him realize, at the end of the first semester, 1952, I am a failure. But that doesn't say anything about 1953. I am a failure this afternoon, and I admit that. But what he tends to do is to think, I am a failure now, I've always been one, I always will be. And thus, the mere imposition into our thinking of something that our language use lacks, the date, the dimension of time, we find sometimes does something. I remember one particular boy who said, when I said when, he said, that's right. I then went on to say, were you a failure last year? No, I had a job, everything was all right. You think you'll be a failure next year? Well, I don't know. Now, the moment he comes to that mood, something happens. He's ready to keep on going. He isn't ready to quit. I remember a committee at another university that had to review applicants for admission to the graduate school. This is a story of a boy, let's call him Dick, who went to a very small school in Ohio, had a good time. Whenever he got a grade better than a C, he invariably got another grade poorer than a C. That is, if he ever got a B, you may be sure that the next marking period, he'd get a D. He was an average student, and he had a good time and didn't do very much study, and graduated with a, as we say, gentleman's C average for 4 years. Came the war, he went into the Air Force, and in 5 years had a brilliant military record. So brilliant that he was invited to stay on for a regular commission, was commissioned to captain, and as part of the Air Force's career program, was permitted to take time off to go to university to see if he could get a bachelor's degree. But when his request for admission, the admission committee looked at it and said, why, this fella, Captain Dick, is a C student. He's a C student. We can't have C students in our graduate school. A B is necessary for admission. And that's what I mean by the exaggerating tendency. To say that Dick is a C student is to exaggerate enormously. He was a C student between 1936 and 1940. And the tendency of our exaggeration is not to look at the thing. It is to be imprisoned in the phrase. He is a C student. But he was a C student from 1936 to 1940. And how easy it is to pin that brand on him as if he never will change. And to the degree that we fail to look at him, to that degree is what we say about him distorting. I ran onto a somewhat moderately amusing illustration of a lady who didn't want to go get her teeth out because she didn't want to go to visit the dentist to save her teeth because she said, I don't want to go to him. He hurts. That dentist hurt me. And it was a very amusing analysis we made of her talking, because when she says the dentist hurts, what's implied? A little bit or all the time? And she implies the latter. We asked her to sit down at the blackboard where I did something very simple. We said, what time was your meeting with him? 2 o'clock. What do you do the first 5 minutes between 2:02 and 2:05? Oh, not much. He just looked at my teeth. Did he hurt then? Oh, no. Then what did he do? Well, at 2:10, he started to dig around. Did it hurt then? Oh, no. Then what did he do? Then he started to drill. And, sir, he liked to kill me. In the period to 10:12, that's when the dentist hurt. Did he hurt after that? Oh, no, not till the time I left. Didn't hurt at all. But when you say the dentist hurts, that's bigger. That's deeper than if you say he hurts from 2:10 to 2:12. And the failure to catch that distinction means that she enlarges her fear. It means that the dentist is a terrible figure. It means that he's a person to be avoided. May I show you this in the life of a little boy? This little boy named David, who was bitten by a squirrel. And the pediatrician prescribed 14 daily anti-rabies shots every day. The first day, he cried only when the needle entered his arm. That is, may I make a very small, I'll make a little circle. When the needle went into his arm, he cried. The second day, he was reluctant to enter the doctor's office. He began to cry when they got right outside the office. The third day, he cried on entering the building. The area of his crying expanded. The fourth day, he didn't want to leave home. Now, if one analyzes his talking in all this period, one gets from him the doctor hurts. It hurts, and there's a continuous broadening. He never says to himself, the doctor hurts. When he pokes the needle into my arm, he says, the doctor hurts. This terrific exaggeration until finally, on the fifth day, he said, Mommy, I don't want to have a shot today. Well, his mother then began to do a little of what we call semantic retraining, general semantic retraining, and she went on like this. She said, yes, David, you will have a shot today, but I will tell you about it. When the doctor takes your arm, it hurts, and you want to cry. That's all right. You may cry when it hurts, but does it hurt now? Notice she's dating. You may cry when it hurts. Does it hurt now? Does it hurt when we ride in the car and park in the lot? Does it hurt when we go into the building through the revolving door? Does it hurt then? No. You don't need to cry when we push the door round and round. You can laugh then. Does it hurt when we sit in the doctor's waiting room and read the picture book? Does it hurt when the doctor takes your arm? Yes, that hurts. Then you cry. Go ahead. When he's all finished, you don't need to cry anymore, and it hurts only a minute, so you can cry for just a minute. David seemed to get it. En route that day, his mother asked from time to time, does it hurt now? Remember, David is 2.5 when this happened. He even laughed when he said no, and during the remaining 10 days, he cried only when the needle hit him. Now, this was a miracle. Never mind the skill and sagacity of the mother. What is important here is that already in a 2.5, one finds this exaggerating, this tremendous growing tendency that's there. And when it's there, it grows up into other more difficult phenomena. I have time for one more overly quick illustration of this in another way. I try a little game with an audience. I give a speech, or I have someone else give a speech, in which he says, in the Bible, there is something about leprosy which is not up to date. Medical science today has a great deal of knowledge about leprosy, which is different from the attitudes toward leprosy implied in the Old Testament. And the speaker makes very clear that he's doing nothing more in his talk about the Old Testament, but talk about this little bit of it having to do with leprosy and some of the strange implications. The speaker does not deal with leprosy as a moral taint. He merely says there are some things in which the Bible is slightly inaccurate. And that's all he does. He talks about that little bit. Then his talk goes on for 10 minutes, and the audience afterwards is given a small, very simple questionnaire to fill out, and there are a lot of unimportant questions, but one important one. If you were to classify or talk about this man, how would you consider him today? In almost every case we've done this, and it makes no difference the sophistication of the audience. At least half of the people will say, oh, that man hates the Bible. He's an agnostic or an atheist. He's a Bible hater. Notice how that expanded from he hated a little bit of it, he disliked a little bit of it, to he disliked it. Now, in our world, the exaggerating tendency makes things very difficult for those people who wish to be moderate. Indeed, if there were time, I should like to say that the moment in world history in which we now live, it is very difficult to be a moderate. It is hard to be against something in a small way. It is hard to be against something in a fraction of the elements. People immediately want to push you. They want to exaggerate. They want you to be against the Bible. Now, I think one ought to be able to criticize the Bible. One ought to be able to talk about reforms in government. One ought to be able to talk about reforms in our social life without immediately being blown up into a wild-eyed radical. Now, I submit that in the moments of our talking and in living, whenever we fail to keep our eyes on the ongoing, complicated, richly various facts of the world in which we live, when we think only of the words we use, we're then in danger of being blinded. It is one of those obvious things to say, of course words are not things. But sometimes this is so obvious that in the hurry and scurry and give and take of daily living, we tend to lose that. And if we tend to lose the obvious and to become oblivious of it, then trouble must be inevitable.
This is Dr. Irving J. Lee, professor of public speaking in the School of Speech at Northwestern University. Mr. Lee, besides being a teacher in the field of general semantics, has written 2 books in this area, How to Talk with People and Language Habits in Human Affairs. At this time, Dr. Lee concludes his series of 6 talks about the problems we humans face in trying to talk sense as he takes a look at the man who knows it all. Dr. Lee.
Suppose you and I, excuse me, were to have a conversation about this very simple item, an apple. Suppose you and I were to talk about it. What are some of the things we might talk about? Well, we might talk about its color, the gradations of color, the size, the weight, the shape, where it came from, what kind it is, what you can do with it, the uses, the particular geometrical shape it has, and so on. And suppose, as we talk, I were to list on the board the individual things we were talking about. And then suppose I had a battery of secretaries and a battery of blackboards, and we wrote on the board all of the things we talked about, all of the uses, the great and tremendous varieties from just plain eating it to distilling it, and all of the other things that we could talk about this as the apple in song and story, the apple in that very great story. We could talk about the chemistry and the physics. And then suppose as we talked, I kept putting these items on the board. And now I'd like to come to my question. How long would we have to stay here talking about the apple until I could go to the board and draw a great big line and put a period and say, stop. That's all that could be said. Nothing more can be said about this. How long would that take us? When I ask students or audiences sometimes the answer to that question, they reply differently. Some will say, forever, a very long time. We never could do it. Some will say, yes, it's possible. We can say all that can be said about this if you leave us alone and let us work on it long enough. That is, there will be a range of replies, but most of the people will tend to say something like this. They will tend to say, no, that isn't all that could be said. There's more. So, in order to account for them, let me put a great big ETC, and so forth, meaning more could be said. I suppose if I were to have done this little demonstration 50 years ago, or perhaps 100 years ago, the number of people in the audience who would agree with me that we haven't said all there is to be said would be far greater today than it would be then. There were loads of people in the 19th century, for example, who somehow believed, if you leave us alone, we can say all there is to be said. There were some historians, like von Ranke, who was going to write a fully developed history. There were some people in the physical sciences who somehow had come to believe that we had come to the end of what could be said about things. Just one example out of very many others. In 1873, Clerk Maxwell gave a paper to the British Association. Now, the name Clerk Maxwell is one of the brilliant names in the history of physics, and I should just like to read 2 paragraphs from that paper. He says, no theory of evolution can be formed to account for the similarity of molecules. That is, Maxwell is using the word molecule in pretty much the same sense that we today would use the word atom. He says, for evolution necessarily implies continuous change, and the molecule is incapable of growth or decay, of generation or destruction. None of the processes of nature from the time when nature began have produced the slightest difference in the properties of any molecule. We are therefore unable to ascribe either the existence of molecules or the identity of their properties to any of the causes which we call natural. Now, please note this sentence. Thus, we have been led along a strictly scientific path very near to the point at which science must stop. In tracing back the history of matter, science is arrested when she assures herself on the one hand that the molecule has been made, and on the other that it has not been made by any of the processes which we call natural. Now, in 1873, Clerk Maxwell was ready to say that when we have proceeded as far as we can, that's the point at which science must stop. Well, it's interesting that 23 years after the date of Clerk Maxwell's speech, Becquerel observed the radioactivity of uranium. Something was happening to molecules. They did change. They were generated. They were being destroyed. 2 years, 25 years after Clerk Maxwell, Madame Curie discovered radium. And at the turn of the century, Rutherford and Soddy demonstrated the fact that the radium atom was in a process of rapid disintegration and was itself derived from uranium, whose atoms were disintegrating at a much slower rate. And 70 years later, the word was given to spend $2 billion on the development of a bomb whose theory was that we have not yet come to the end of what we know about the molecule. Nevertheless, it is widely believed today, and I suspect one can get a great deal of agreement, that whenever we talk about anything, probably we will not come to the end of what could be said about it. That when we finish, we perhaps will put a great big comma and et cetera to mean or to imply that more can be said. Now, of course, this isn't anything new. Loads of people have realized this. Thoreau, in his Walden, wrote, "The universe is wider than our views of it." And Walter de la Mare, the poet, wrote, "What we see and hear is only the smallest fraction of what is." And George Santayana wrote, "The most exhaustive account which human science can ever give of anything does not cover all that is true about it." And I even note that William James said, "The word 'and' trails along after every sentence, something always escapes." And to complete this list, to remember that Hamlet at one point turns and says, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamed on in our philosophy." So I like the way that wag said it, who, while working on his grapefruit, "There's more in this than meets the eye." That is to say, the world in which we live is a big one. It's full of innumerable details. We talk about the apple, and the number of details and aspects and factors and characteristics that we can talk about, that number is tremendous. I'm almost unwilling to say that it's infinite, but it's tremendous. So that whenever we talk about anything, what must we do, if this is true? If someone were to give a talk about the apple, 10 minutes, 30 minutes, 100-minute talk, what would he do? He would select some things to talk about, and he would omit the remainder. Thus, fundamental in the human talking process is that we abstract, we take out of the great number some and omit the remainder. We select some and omit everything that we don't select. And I should like to suggest that this is what talking is like. One can't possibly talk about everything. One can't possibly, I now think, say everything there is to be said about anything. So what does one do? He selects some of the details and omits the remainder. Now, why, if we were to give an assignment, say, to a dozen people to talk about the apple, why, in all probability, would each talk about different aspects of the apple? Well, our psychology friends have all sorts of explanations. You select some things to talk about, you others, based on your conditioning, your experience, your capacity. I think the broad word interest, the things that interest you, are the things which will determine what you select. I saw a bit of a comic bit in the newspaper some time ago under the heading, When the Family Buys a Car. Father, how many miles to the gallon? Mother, what color is the upholstery? The son, how fast will she go? The daughter, let's see the mirror. And the neighbor, how on earth can they afford it? That is, each of us will talk about those details which interest us and omit the others. One more story, if you can bear with me. A student copied this from the Louisville Courier-Journal some time ago. It's about a young mother who came to the door of the nursery and saw her husband, a lumber dealer, standing over the baby's crib. Silently, she watched him as he stood looking down at the sleeping infant. In his face, she read rapture, doubt, admiration, ecstasy, incredulity, wonder. Deeply touched, with eyes glistening, she tiptoed to his side and put her arms around his neck. A penny for your thoughts, my dear, she whispered. Startled into consciousness, he blurted, for the life of me, I don't see how they can make a crib like that for $4. Well, the things that interest some of us are not the things that interest others of us. And I suppose I've merely been trying to say one very small thing, namely, that at the end of anything we say, there is more. That so far as we know, more can be said. Well, what does this mean in everyday life? So what, I suppose, is again the obvious question. What difference does it make that the moment a man starts talking, he talks about what he talks about and he omits the remainder? I should like to discuss some of the varieties of human behavior which take place when people forget this. What happens in the hurry and scuffle of the daily grind when people go about their work unaware of this simple wisdom? And I should like, just as a way of introducing the subject, to ask you, have you ever run onto people who in conversation or argument leave you with the feeling that what they say about anything is all there is to be said about it? Have you ever run onto people in the course of your business or non-business activities who leave you with the feeling, well, I said it, period, nothing more remains to be said? I want to talk about that attitude, and I want to give it a name. We call it the disease of allness. And by allness, I merely mean the attitude, the manner, the mood, the way of thinking and talking in which a person implies, or sometimes says, that what he knows about anything is all there is to be known about it. And I should like to discuss some of the implications and difficulties that we get into. Now, I very rarely see anybody who comes right out and says, what I know about it is all there is to be known or all there is to be said. I very rarely see it so baldly as in Clarence Day's play, Life with Father. You may remember in Act 2, Scene 1, Father has been wanting a conversation with his eldest son, Clarence, about some man-to-man thing. And they've had some trouble, but finally they're alone, and Father turns and says, Clarence, there are things about women that I think you ought to know. Women aren't the angels that you think they are. You see, Clarence, we men have to run this world. It's not an easy job. It takes work and it takes thinking. Now, you take a woman thinks. Oh, I'm wrong right there. A woman doesn't think at all. She gets stirred up, and then she tries to get you stirred up, too. But if you can keep reason and logic in the argument, a man can hold his own, of course. But if they can switch you, pretty soon the argument's about whether you love them or not. I swear I don't know how they do it. But if you watch out and know just how to handle them, you'll be all right. All a man has to do is to be firm. But Clarence, who's been observing things around the day's household, interrupts and says, "Yes, Father, but what can you do when they cry?" And Father says, "Well, that's quite a question. You just have to make them understand that what you're doing is for their own good. And now, Clarence, you know all about women." Well, that's Father. Father is much too bald, much too explicit, much too overt. Most of the time, I don't see allness that way. I see allness in much subtler form. And I should like to discuss at least one of those subtler manifestations of this difficulty. I'd like to talk about it in terms of the problem of unteachability. The problem of human unteachability. Now, I see that. Anybody who ever teaches in a classroom sees it, but I see it particularly in some experience I've had teaching policemen. Now, some of my best friends are policemen, delightful people on the whole.